Release that which I by Ermu. Chapter 121 Looting. When he had talked to all of the 5 noble families, Roland felt slightly relieved. When he leaned back into the chair, Nightingale took the initiative to step behind him, putting both her hands on his shoulders and began to massage them. From the moment of defeating the Duke, up until he had taken over the Lord's castle, had needed merely 1 day. Things were going much smoother than he had initially thought. The moment after the Duke had died, most of the people had chosen to surrender. For mercenaries, it was more usual to change their sides during the war, so they just kneeled on the ground, saying that they were willing to fight for the prince. So the mercenaries became responsible for guarding over the surrendered knights and nobles, while the First Army was responsible for guarding the mercenaries. Like this, the big group moved further towards to the east, and in the afternoon at 3 p.m. they finally arrived at Longsong stronghold. When the guards saw the head of the dead duke and the other captured nobles, they had immediately opened the gate, letting the 4th prince into the city. Roland didn't wait until all the nobles were gathered, giving them the chance to welcome him with great fanfare and to declare him as new city lord. Instead, he immediately left for the lord's castle. The castle was placed in the middle of the city and looked like a city within the city. When he entered the castle area, a small skirmish broke out. Nightingale had to use an explosion cache to blow open the entrance to the flower garden. Within the garden, more than 20 guards loyal to the old duke tried to stop Roland from stepping in, but they all were quickly killed by the First Army. However, the guards had still been able to use their hand crossbows, resulting in 5 injuries, of which 2 had been seriously injured. Fortunately, Nana had come along with the military operation and had quickly been able to heal them. In the meantime, 10 personal guards used this opportunity to take the rest of the Duke's family to flee through the back door, but they were still spotted by lightning and were captured soon afterwards. The Duke's wife and her 2 sons' hands were tied and were waiting to be judged. Even now they were still in the dark, ignorant of the fact that the Duke had been defeated. When Roland gained control over the Lord's castle, Border Town's First Army immediately swarmed out and took over the castle district. When comparing the Lord's castle in Longsong stronghold with the castle in Border Town, Roland had to admit that the stronghold's castle had a much more magnificent shape. It had a hexagonal outline with 6 watchtowers on its wall, and a 5-story high tower in the middle. During this era, it was really rare to build places that were this high. Within the castle grounds, there were also the residences of the castle's inhabitants, warehouses, stables and everything else they needed. The Duke even had his own personal prison under the castle's basement. He put the valuable prisoners like the Duke's family into this exact prison. The civilians were all freed, while the mercenaries had their weapons confiscated and placed into the castle garden or its free rooms. At the same time, he also picked out some leaders and paid them to keep watch themselves. In Roland's eyes, the Northern Slope mine would be the best destination for these opportunistic people, but at the moment he still had more important things he had to do. Until now, he had still to do the most important task after a battle, which was commonly known as looting the corpse. Roland, together with a witch, kept looking over everything over and over again inside of the castle. He hadn't even let go of the God's Stone of Retaliation he had found in the vault. After they had searched through everything, the gain was really impressive. Just within 2 boxes they had discovered in the basement, he found already more than 10,000 gold royals alone. Within a hidden chamber in the bedroom, Nightingale discovered several scores of eyeball-sized gems. Echo found another chamber hidden behind the fireplace, which wasn't only filled with a variety of gold crafts, such as the scepter, the crown, etc., there were also many pieces of dazzling jewelry, neatly hung on the wall on a wooden frame. This were all the Duke's personal financial resources. When Roland saw all this great wealth in front of him and compared it with the 500 gold royals he had gathered in the last 2 seasons, his heart was filled with myriads of regrets. He wasn't prepared for how alluring the feeling of looting was. If he didn't come from a highly developed industrial era, he most probably would have kept everything for himself. But now he could only sigh with sorrow. He had to think of the greater picture. In the foreseeable future, the working population in the border town would increase substantially, and before he could develop his territorial agriculture, he would need to import large amounts of grain from other sources. So all the treasure was stored into boxes and were lightened by Hummingbird, then under the protection of Iron Axe and several personal guards, they were brought back to his own castle storage in Border Town. With the time included to enchant everything, the delivery would take around 3 days. Because of this, after the second day Roland no longer took in gold royals as ransom. Eating the Duke had brought him many benefits, and now he only needed more living people and animals. "Your Highness, do you really only want to stay here for a week?" asked Nightingale. "What?" Roland had closed his eyes, enjoying the tingling burst coming from his shoulders. "This is the largest city in the West, right?" she whispered. "Compared to Border Town, why don't you want to stay in this more prosperous place? The power structure in Longsong Stronghold is tangled and complicated, it isn't suitable for doing what I want to do. And with my plan, we would keep the status quo, what isn't so bad. If I want to change it, the resistance I would encounter would only become larger, and if I would use cruel ways they would lump together trying to sweep me away." Roland smiled and said, "Of course the most important part is that the people here in the stronghold are deeply affected by the church, so it would become difficult to get the people to accept you. I have once said that I hope that the witches will be able to walk freely through the streets, and in Border Town, this is now possible." "Yeah," Nightingale said softly, "you have already fulfilled your promise." Early on the third day, Petrov brought in his list in a hurry, and as usual Roland received him in the hall. "Your Highness, I have made my decision." "I will take a look," said Roland and received the list from him. And just like he had expected, on top of the list with the biggest amount of needed points were serfs with the value of 2, about 800 people, also 100 cattle and 300 sheep for a total of 900 points, the rest were paid with all kinds of craftsmen. "Your Royal Highness, is this acceptable?" "Of course, you only had to scrap 3,000 points together." Roland returned the list to him. "By when will you be able to gather all these people and supplies?" "Today will be possible, at least in the case of the people and other properties they will stay in the honeysuckle territory, but Your Highness, if you want to bring them back with you to Border Town, it may take about 2 weeks' time." "It's up to you to organize the transport to Border Town," said Roland, tapping the table. "As a merchant, you should have the experience of organizing a caravan." "Yes, sir." Petrov hesitated for a moment, then "My father." "You can take him back with you today," said the prince laughingly and handed him a parchment scroll. "If you think there is no problem with it, just sign it and imprint your thumb onto it." "This is the representative's contract?" Petrov only had read the beginning and then he spoke agitated. "Do you really promise to grant the right to govern over Longsong Stronghold to the Honeysuckle family?" "Please wait for a moment." He spread out the scroll and began to read the contract carefully. Seeing that Petrov showed caution, Roland nodded with satisfaction. As a collaborator, paying attention to the contracts is the most basic requirement. After a while, Petrov raised his head. "This contract and what you told me yesterday is basically the same, but there is one thing." He pointed to the end of the contract. "Your Royal Highness, shouldn't I write my father's name here? The Count is after all the representative of my family." Roland smiled. "Of course not, it was you, not your father, who talked with me about the post as representative, so it's naturally to write your name at the end of the contract." For a moment Petrov became startled, he couldn't believe what he had heard, so he asked, "Your Highness, you don't mean that?" "Yes, you will take over the place of the Duke and rule over the stronghold." Roland nodded. "If you're able to fulfill the contract, you can continue to rule over the city even after I became the king." Here he paused and smiled. "But if you break the contract, you will meet the same end as the Duke. Since I was able to break into Longsong Stronghold once, there is no problem to do it for a second time. Let's work well together, Mr. Ambassador." Chapter 122 Father and Son. The dungeons of the castle were not so dark and wet as the prison of Border Town. Maybe the Duke didn't want to turn his basement into a haunted house, or smell the nauseating stench as soon as he descended the stairs. Generally speaking, the dungeon was still relatively clean. The cells were also differently decorated accordingly to its grade. Some were empty, some were not only decorated with a bed, they even had a wardrobe, a desk, and chandeliers were also readily available. Probably the cells were also a place for the Duke to keep some of the nobility, so the basic etiquette had to be guaranteed. Roland also found a special cell in the corner. Within it stood a large bed taking more than half the room. There were also chains hanging down from the ceiling, but the chain for the neck and hands were wrapped in layers of sheepskin, and on the wall hung a variety of whips. It seems that Duke Ryan had also conducted research in some areas, he thought. It's a pity that I have to leave in a few days, so I cannot analyze it carefully. As the most valuable prisoner, Lord Hull was naturally in the best cell. If someone didn't focus on the external iron railings, they could think this was a luxury bedroom. Furthermore, he also had to share the room with Count Maple Leaf, Viscount Wolf, the eldest son of the Wild Rose family and the second son of the Elk family. Together with the Ryan family, these were the 6 ruling family of the Longsong stronghold. Of course, the Ryan family had been destroyed by Roland, so his wife and his sons were kept in a cell next door. When the other people saw that the prince had appeared in the dungeon, the nobles stood up. Not waiting for them to start their questioning, Roland began first. I will take Count Honeysuckle with me, so you can come out. As for the rest of you, we are still waiting for the ransom. The moment they pay, I will let you out. Father, shouted Petrov at the moment when he saw him. Then he glanced at his friend, and then to Roland. Your Highness, I didn't see the name of Count Elk on the list. If he died on the battlefield, the eldest son of the Elk family should be now the head of the family, but at the moment he isn't at home, so there is no one who could take over this job, and René cannot be redeemed. But if you let him out, he could go home and organize his self-redeeming? I am willing to give a guarantee for him. Do you mean the eldest son of the Elk family, Jacques Med? Roland shook his head. He already came back. Not only did he come back to the stronghold, no, he even came to the castle yesterday, but I don't believe he will pay the ransom. Hearing this, René dashed to the front of the cage. Why? He said since you didn't protect your father on the battlefield, it was the same as you being his executioner. Why did he say this? The one who killed our father. René immediately closed his mouth. Roland didn't take his outburst seriously. What you wanted to say, that it was obviously me who killed the count, right? He went in front the cage. Previously to the months of the demons, your father sent intruders into my castle, trying to burn my food reserves, said Roland. And now he followed the Duke onto the battlefield, taking his knights to attack my territory. I merely started a counterattack, to repel the invaders. But now I'm the murderer? Shouldn't it be Duke Ryan who had ordered your father to act be the one who gets condemned? In addition, if it were not for Hills's statement that you did not know anything about the attempt to burn my food, you would already be a dead man by now. René was left speechless. Your Royal Highness, Petrov asked, worried. If his brother doesn't pay the ransom for him, will you kill René? No, that won't be the case. After all, I'm always kind. Roland grinned. Most probably I will take him with me to Border Town. There he will work 20 years in the North Slope mine to redeem himself. How much is his ransom? As a second son, he has no chance to inherit the title. The price for him is much smaller than for Count Honeysuckle. As long as someone pays a value of 1,000 points in materials, he can go. Roland looked at him with interest. How is it? Do you want to pay the ransom for him? What value? 1,000 gold royals? Count Honeysuckle interrupted their talk. Your son will inform you later of what it means. The prince gave them the signal to move. Come on, there is nothing for us to do down here. Since he is the second son of the Elk family, there is no need to rush it for a while yet, so you can go back and then slowly consider it. The entire group finally left the prison. When they came to the gate of the castle, the count suddenly stopped. Your Royal Highness, I know Duke Ryan acted sinfully and it's unforgivable, but his wife and son are innocent. Perhaps, Roland couldn't deny his words. I did not intend to sentence them to be exiled or to hang them and so on. I will just take them with me to Border Town and place them into the prison there. Until the day I ascend the throne, he thought. Now it is not the time to be benevolent to a woman. Even if they aren't guilty, he would get no benefits if he was to release them. Furthermore, he would only bring another source of problems to himself. After all, the eldest son has had legal right of succession. Asterisk. What did you just say? Asked Shalafi Hull, disbelieving, and stared with open mouth at Petrov. His Royal Highness doesn't intend to live in Longsong Stronghold. and furthermore he even wants you to govern the stronghold for him? When they were back to Count Honeysuckle's castle, Petrov immediately told his father everything that had happened during the last 3 days. When the other one heard about the representative's contract, the count couldn't bear to wait for another confirmation. He jumped up and walked through the study in circles, obviously feeling a very complicated emotion. "Father, are you all right?" asked Perrault worriedly. "So it seems that our opponents are mainly elk family. Compared to them, the other 3 have neither the heritage nor the strength, so they shouldn't be a problem for us." "What?" He couldn't follow what his father meant. "You're such a disappointment," said the count, "you really let me down. His Highness gave you such a good chance, but even now you haven't figured out who your opponents are." Aren't you surprised?" "You mean the fact that the prince insists on going back to Border Town?" "Of course, I also think it's strange." The count grasped his beard, "but his reasons have nothing to do with us. For us it's only important that the contract is true." This is indeed the case, Petrov thought. I cannot believe that His Highness would go through all this trouble only to make fun of me. As for why he loves to live in Border Town, later I will have enough time to find out the true reasons. But I would never have thought that my father's ability to accept the new circumstance was this strong. Did I hear it right? Is that mead boy your friend? Shalafi suddenly stood in front of Petrov. "Tomorrow, you will go over and redeem him." "You agree that I spend 1,000 gold royals to redeem him?" Petrov got startled. "Think about it, Count Elk died and the eldest son doesn't want to redeem the second son, and during the battle, with the exception of a few knights, they had almost no losses. Once Jacques Med took over the title, he will try to hinder your success in the future." "No," said the count, "why Jacques didn't want to redeem René is because he is afraid that the other will be a threat him." "Alright, it turns out this was the true reason," Perrault smiled in his heart. But he also knew that his father was correct. René had grown up with swords and spears. Furthermore, he was much closer to the knights within their territory, unlike Jacques the eldest son, who doesn't have the body and air of a lord. Instead he preferred the debauched life of a noble. Although René had repeatedly shown that he wanted to be a knight, but that was the time where he had no chance to inherit. But now that the count was dead, who could guarantee that he wouldn't ask for the help of the other knights, who could kill the eldest son for him? So why redeem a person who would later become a problem to himself? Jacques' decision was very simple and ruthless. "My friend would never do that," he assured. "Perhaps, but after you have redeemed him, Jacques will get a headache, whether he has any intention of doing so or not." Shalafi further explained, "As for the materials worth 1,000 points, we can just choose some more craftsmen. When I prepared the ransom for you, I have already transferred some of our craftsmen, and in the case, I will now transfer even more. We won't have enough craftsmen in our own territory." "Do not worry about it, you know that the north has become quite a mess," explained the count confidently. "Most of the 4 kingdoms' forces were killed at Hermes, so everywhere the lords have forced the people into their armies, there is now a large number of refugees. We can just take this opportunity to eat a little more, like this we can even save some of our monthly payment." Hearing all these explanations, Petrov discovered that his father was also an expert businessman. At least his business ability was much stronger than his ability on the battlefield. Chapter 123: The Invitation of the Church. It was already the 4th day since Roland had taken over the castle. Today nearly all nobles in the surrounding areas were gathered inside the castle grand hall. Although most people already knew of the news, Roland still felt that it was necessary to tell them personally that the Western Territory now had a new ruler. After he informed them about his intentions to move back to Border Town and that the eldest son of the Honeysuckle family would now rule in his stead, everyone had suddenly started to discussing the news. Of course, no one was willing to take the lead at this time to stand up and object to it. After all, the Duke's head was still hanging above the city gate, and news that King Timothy had suffered a great loss and couldn't send any external forces was now also known to everyone. Furthermore, all the knights of the Honeysuckle family had already been redeemed, while at the same time he hadn't accepted any ransom for the other knights, so that the knights, together with the mercenaries, could all come back with him to Border Town. In Roland's plan, the mercenaries would be sent to the mine, where they could work to earn their freedom, and the knights would get a job offer in case they showed their repentance and had good manner. after all, most knights were literate and could thus also be used as teachers. Of course, for the rest of their life they wouldn't ever be allowed to ever use a weapon again. If it was handled like this, the Honeysuckle family should have enough power to hold the other 4 noble families back, and they should also have enough troops to defend Longsong's stronghold and their own territory as well, Roland thought. As for the invisible stirring undercurrent, it's a problem that Petrov will have to worry about on his own. In the past few days, he also took the time to send some border town residents back who had rebelled during the winter where many people had died out due to hunger and the cold, including the former finance minister Ferrero. They would all face trial in border town. His only regret was that the mastermind behind the attempt to burn his food and the death of Greyhound, Count Med, had already been killed on the battlefield. Today, the traffic between the Longsong stronghold and border town has finally been restored, which meant that until the end of next week many ships would sail upstream to border town to deliver the gathered supplies. Roland guessed that Berev would be very busy for the few next weeks. He had not only received a lot of looted gold coins, he also had to organize the resettlement of the large number of immigrants. Also, it was still unknown whether Karl had built enough wooden sheds. Thinking of these problems, he could not help but want to return to the border town as soon as possible. In addition, the great farming operation also needed to start soon. After entertaining all the nobles to lunch, Roland intended to take a nap, but then one of his guards announced a special guest. The high priest of the church in Longsong stronghold. Hearing this, Roland suddenly had no thought of sleep left. Longsong stronghold was completely different from border town. Here the church had already been rooted for a long time. They not only had a church, they have even dispatched a high priest to this place. This was also the prince's main reason that he had decided to further develop border town rather than staying further in Longsong stronghold. Here the people were already under the influence of the church for a long time and any of the civilian could become their eyes. Here his plan to manipulate the people's view would become complicated and the risk that the witches would be discovered would also become much higher. Unless he completely unrooted the church, his reforms would never get a chance to work. Paying attention to the replacement of the ruler of Longsong stronghold is a normal thing for the church, so Roland wasn't too surprised that they would send him a representative to come into contact with him. However, the identity of the person they sent was a bit special. As the high priest of the church, he belonged to the most influential people of people. The area under his jurisdiction was of a similar size to that of a duke. Once more he decided to use the grand hall as the meeting place. The high priest Tylo seemed to be around 40 years old. He was dressed in the typical church style with a white underrobe and a blue robe above it, giving him a very neat appearance and a behavior that was just like a courteous aristocracy. If he wasn't a member of the royal family and allied with the witches, Roland believed that holding a conversation with such a person would have been a pleasure. As the high priest, he had to be in possession of a high-quality god stone of retaliation, so in order to avoid any accidents, Roland specifically told Nightingale before the meeting that she should stay away from him during it. After Tylo gave him a salute, Roland invited him to sit at the table and ordered some tea. No matter what he thought, he had to at least show a welcoming atmosphere on the surface. "Your Royal Highness, I'm here as a representative of the new holy city," Tylo said with a smile. "You have become the veritable master of the Western Territory, may God bless you." "Thank you," Roland said in a relaxed tone. "You do not seem to care at all that I've gotten rid of Duke Ryan and taken over Longsong stronghold. We rarely intervene in secular disputes. As long as the people can live a good life, he has to be a good ruler. So in which family he was born, or if he belonged to the royal family, it is not important to the church. In fact, I think the church is much more open-minded in this respect. Previously I was only a farmer's son, and now I have become a high priest," he smiled. "Excuse me, my lord, but I don't believe that a mere farmer could become a duke, right? If he launched an uprising to overthrow the royal family, he can even become the king." Roland thought, so he never spoke it out. Instead, he went straight for the topic. "So why did you come today? Was it only to deliver the blessing?" "The blessing was only part of what I have come for. I also want to offer a cooperation between us." "Cooperation? What kind of cooperation?" "We would help you with whatever you need to expand your territory or your forces." "Hold on," Roland frowned. You just said that the church rarely intervenes in secular disputes. Rarely intervention doesn't mean no intervention, said the high priest, still casually. I have said that as long as the people in this world have a smooth and peaceful life, we will not intervene. But the struggle between your brother Timothy and your third sister Garcia has resulted in widespread poverty throughout the South. In the beginning, we thought that Timothy deserved it and would become a respected king, but now we think he isn't any longer worthy. You are such a man. Roland got a thoughtful look. It seems the church has the desire to help me fight for the throne. He subconsciously asked. Why? You lead the people of Border Town to resist the demon beasts, and spend the whole months of the demons with them in Border Town. This all proves your courage and ability. And from the large amount of food you purchased from Willow Town, everyone can see do not want your people to starve, which shows your kindness. With this you have the 3 grandeur characteristics a noble should have. Furthermore, you are even of royal blood. All this are the reason why we chose you. Roland didn't believe one word the high priest said, but at least it proved that, even if Border Town was at the edge of the country and was an independent island state during the winter, they were still under the close watch of the church. How would you help? Would you dispatch an army of judges to fight for me? Even though we want to quell the warring state in the South as soon as possible, but if we were to do something like you suggested, we would arouse the resentment of most of the nobility. So we can only help you materially. The high priest took 2 pills out of his pocket. One was black, the other was red. On both the sigil of the holy city had been etched. This is our equivalent to the drugs produced in your alchemy square. The red pills will temporarily make your men stronger, while the black pill reduces the feeling of pain and coldness and instead increases their endurance by several times. With these drugs, your army should become unstoppable, and the church would only charge you the production cost. For a moment Tylo paused. 1 gold royal. These 2 pills can be presented to you as a test product to prove that my statement is the truth. What is the reward you are hoping for? Expanding the reach of the church and building churches in every territory? Of course this would make us happy, but our main intention is to end the war. As long as the people can have a peaceful life, they will naturally come into God's arms. Roland accepted the offered pills. This sounds amazing, but for the time being, I have no intention of competing for the crown of the Kingdom of Greycastle. Both Timothy and Garcia are my close relatives and I do not want to hurt them. I can understand your point, the high priest smiled reassuringly, but sometimes the bonds of family cannot stop the temptation of power, especially when you become only a stumbling stone on the road to power for others. These pills will only be the beginning. There are still many other possibilities of how we could help you. If you decide to take that step, you can always come to the church to find me. Having said all of this, he stood up, bent down in salute. With this I have already informed you of the church's intentions. May God be with you, your Royal Highness. Chapter 124 Return to Border Town. I have probably never seen you lie as much as you have today, Nightingale said as she stepped out from her fog right after Tylo has left. How was it for the church's high priest? Roland asked. Could you tell if he was lying? No, my sight was blocked by his god stone of retaliation. At the place where he was standing, I could only see a mass of darkness. Unfortunately, he couldn't treat the high priest the same way that he has all the other nobles, Roland thought, full of regret. He then placed the 2 pills on the table. Tell me, do these pills really have some kind of miraculous effects? Reducing the pain, the same could be done by morphine. As for increasing the strength, it sounds like it increases the rate at which the adrenal gland releases hormones. The problem is, how did they manage to extract these substances and make it into these pills? If the church had such a high technical level, they should have conquered the world long ago. Wait a minute. Roland suddenly thought of a possibility. Could they have done it with magic? You were able to see the flow of magic, right? He looked at Nightingale. Can you see any traces of magic in these 2 pills? Nightingale took the pills in her hand and gave them a close observation, but when she gave them back she could only say, "There is no magic to see, but for me, they resemble the god stone of retaliation a bit." God stone of retaliation? Roland asked in confusion. Well, she nodded. You were with me in my world of fog. It's only black and white, but the darkness of the normal black and the darkness of the God's stone of retaliation are different. From the latter, I sense a feeling of emptiness as if it was trying to swallow the world around it. I do not know how to better describe that feeling. Nightingale hesitated. Rather than speaking of a black hole, it's more like there is nothing there at all. Nothingness? That's right, they give off a feeling of nothingness, she nodded acknowledging. The two pills give me also a feeling of nothingness, but only very subtly, and, also it's not a round hole, but rather a section of flowing thin black threads. Can this nothingness affect your ability? Nightingale grabbed the pills once more and suddenly entered the fog, only to reappear soon afterward. They seem to have no effect on my ability. I think it's still better to take prisoners with a death sentence and let them eat these pills to try out their effects. Roland wrapped a piece of paper carefully around the pills, only then did he put them into his pocket. I would never have expected that the church would have such a good impression of you, Nightingale said after she sat back by the prince's side, giving off a depressed feeling. If the high priest didn't wear his God's stone of retaliation, I bet of the 10 sentences he had spoken 9 would be lies. Roland said in disdain, in the end, the most important point is that what they are offering and what they are asking for, simply don't add together. Why? Look at what they want, more churches, more believers, a prince or king who only gains power with their support, and will henceforth spread their divine propaganda. A stable country is more conducive to the development of believers and the development of their power. Otherwise, under the chaos of war, the church and the monastery would be reduced to refugees and become the target for robbing nobles. But can't they just have taken a fancy for you, because you can bring the people a peaceful life? I don't think so, Roland shook his head. Stability stems from unity or equilibrium. Even if the king idles away only seeking pleasure every day, the people would still be better off than those who are living within the countries that are at war. So if they were to support the second prince, it wouldn't be so surprising. It would also not be strange if they were to decide to support my sister Garcia, but what is strange that they would come to me and offer their support, especially now after Garcia has just won against Timothy. If the church was to now fully support Garcia, I am afraid that the eastern territories of the kingdom would be swallowed by her in less than 6 months. With that, around 40% of the country would fall under the rule of the Queen of Clearwater, and the pressure I would have to face would start to exponentially increase. Yet they don't support the strong, but instead they chose the most vulnerable candidate, from their point of view. This situation seemingly has to be advantageous to the church. Assuming I was to accept their support, the already complicated situation in this country with 2 kings would then become even more chaotic. The direct consequence of a 3-sided war would be a sharp drop in population, a rapid loss of wealth, and since the war would spread over the whole country, its unifying it would only be delayed even more. What advantage is there to the church in this? Needless to say, they won't get more believers. I'm afraid that even the churches built in all the cities will all be torn down until nothing is left. It seems you don't understand the nobles' way of thinking. They are always twisting and turning, Nightingale sighed. Well, Roland replied laughingly, I don't belong to them. Nightingale narrowed her eyes, staring at the prince for a long time. Strange, why wasn't this a lie? Asterisk. 3 days later, Roland had finally cleared out the castle and the stronghold's library and was now sailing back on Little Town while very satisfied. Along the Cherchouet River, near Border Town, the river scene has changed its appearance during the last few days. In the areas near Border Town which had been burned open by Anna, there were now many people who were very busy, seeing their dresses. They should be the first serfs who had been transported to Border Town. And in the area near the impassable mountain range, there were erected a number of simple wooden sheds. Within the sheds Roland could also faintly see some activity. He thought it should be the serf's family. These people were tied to the land for generations. Their children would also be born as serfs. Because of this they couldn't see any hope, ending in living a life filled with numbness. Their motivation to work the land came not from their hearts, instead, it came from the slavers' whips. The resulting low productivity was simply a great waste of human resources. There was no doubt that slavery was the enemy of industrial production and was a system which had to be abolished. But Roland did not intend to let them all turn into free hands, but he wanted to provide them a road out, so that they could see the hope of promotion to becoming free people, even if such a kind master was to give his slaves the possibility to get rid of their slave status was to be a precedent, this kind of compromise on handling serfs wouldn't arouse much attention even if the news was to circulate. At most, the other nobles would think that he was just a kind person, nothing more. He only had to wait until the time was ripe in the future, then he would fully abolish slavery. By that time the resistance he would face would be much less. The area near the pier was crowded with sailboats, making it clear that the small pier was unable to handle all these ships. Fortunately, Little Town was more of a light craft, so it didn't need a dock to land. It seems that I also have to put the task of developing the pier on the schedule, Roland thought. When he was finally back at the castle, he couldn't allow himself any time to rest. Instead, he immediately went to his office to call Barav, letting him report about Border Town's actual situation and its materials. The assistant minister has already been prepared for a long time now, so he only had to take out a roll of parchment out of his pocket and spread it out on the large wooden table. Your Royal Highness, the amount of materials you sent back to Border Town really scared me. That said, the upturned corner of his mouth still gave away his mood. 12 of my apprentices needed a whole night to count all the coins, which were more than 14,000 gold royals. This is equivalent to the annual income of an ordinary city's. To accumulate all these gold royals the Duke probably needed more than 20 years, Roland thought. Most probably it comes from the plunder and exploitation of the people in the Western Territory. I have to turn them into food, steel, and machinery as soon as possible. Those jewels, how much worth are the jewelry and handicrafts? I haven't had the time to convert them yet. By conservative estimates they are also worth around 10,000 gold royals. If they were auctioned in King City, their price would be even greater. But for now, they are only stored in the basement of your castle. Barrow paused. However, this means that the original storage room isn't big enough for all the food, so I suggest that you will increase the castle's area, building further storage warehouses to store other supplies. Chapter 125 Municipal Development. What can you tell me about the people they've sent? Roland asked. That's right, please take a look below. The assistant minister pointed to the bottom of the parchment. Until now 1 foot 100 inches people were sent to Border Town. Most of them belong to the ranks of serfs, in accordance with your request have all been held outside of the town. The 35 craftsmen have been placed under Karl's command and their homes are all located in the new civilization district. Barav spoke these unusual mouthful of the terms, but your Royal Highness, is this really okay? I thought that area had specially been prepared for the witches. The people I have sent out to spread the news about the safe haven haven't returned yet. Their progress is slower than I would have imagined. So, the first houses will be used for the craftsmen and their families. We can still build more afterwards. Roland's plan was to renovate the whole Border Town. The wooden houses and mud cottages would be converted into brick houses, while at the same time leaving enough space for wide streets between the houses, rather than the alleys just wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, that they had now. Understood, Barav nodded. Your Highness, I've heard that there will also be cattle and sheep being shipped here? Ah, that's true. But not now, I deliberately let them come a few days later. They will come together with the shepherds. They will be sent to the grasslands between the western city wall, the concealing forest and the impassable mountain range. That should be a good area to turn into a pasture. We should reopen the destroyed part of the city wall and use it as an exit. After all, the wall is only useful during the months of the demons. For now, they finally had enough people and money to break through the bottleneck and allow Border Town to develop further, so Roland was finally able to use all of his otherworldly knowledge. He called one of the guards into his office and ordered them, go find Karl and tell him to meet me in the executive office. I guess if he isn't at the mine he will certainly be at the new area outside the town. Half an hour later, Karl walked into the office and bowed in greeting to Roland. Your Highness. It has been nearly 6 months since he had seen the mason for the first time and since he had been recruited into the staff of the town hall, he could be regarded as the busiest official in the last half-year. First he had to preside over the construction of the city walls, and then there were the houses in the new district and the temporary wooden sheds for the new inhabitants of Border Town. Now, on his 35-year-old silhouette, he revealed the first few strands of silver and his skin has also started darkening from always being outside. But the spirit Roland had seen burning in him at their first meeting was still burning as strong and hot as ever before. That a new environment could quickly change a man was true. Only 6 months ago Carl was still carefully trying to hide himself, clearly busy running away from trouble. But now, as an experienced project commander who had personally been in charge of several people, even his gestures showed some hints of him feeling in power. But what Roland appreciated the most was that he was always still willing to accept the thoughts of other people. Roland acknowledged his greeting with a smile. "Please sit, and come take a look at his." He handed him some sketches that he had previously drawn. "You see, I need you to build something new for me. This building looks like a warehouse." Well, building it with its base placed on stilts it would be safe against incoming floods. Carl quickly swept over the first sketch and then turned to the second one, and after looking for a while he asked, "Is this supposed to be a furnace?" "Yes, I need you to build more than 5 of these furnaces near the North Slope mine. They will be needed to calcine the cement and to burn clay bricks. So, you have to find an empty spot which still has good transport channels, and the area should be spacious enough so that we can still later build some more furnaces there." "I understand." Carl now turned his view to the last sketch and immediately frowned after he saw it. "This seems to be sewers?" "No, there is also a roof and walls, and the area behind it looks like a pond." "Your Royal Highness, I seem to be unable to make sense of this." Roland laughed. "This is a toilet, and will also be your construction project of the highest priority." "A toilet?" Carl thought about it. "Your Highness, where do you plan to build them?" "For this, you already have chamber pots placed in your castle, and your attendants are responsible for cleaning them on a regular basis. Most of the villagers don't even use them, instead, they are doing it directly outside of their houses," Carl explained. "The same is also true for the serfs, which can directly discharge their filth into the Shurshui River, and the river will then take their filth away." "So, that was the strong smell I smelled today at the dock." Roland shook his head, trying to erase these unpleasing thoughts. "If that is the case, we need to change this bad habit as soon as possible." "A bad habit?" Carl still didn't seem to understand what the prince's meaning. For a commoner who was accustomed to urinating at any place, it was naturally hard for them to understand how beautiful a casual stroll could be without having to fear stepping on a landmine, Roland criticized privately. "Anyway, you only have to follow these sketches. I have already roughly marked their size, so you only have to use this distance. Within the vicinity of the wooden shed district, you should build at least 4 toilets, always 2 side by side. In addition, the wall in the middle of the ditch should be built out of brick, while the outside walls and the roof have to be built out of wood. Like this you can save a lot of cement." "Your Highness, you want to build them side by side, that," said Carl slowly. Evidently, he thought that talking about this dirty theme with His Highness was clearly degrading the royalty's dignity. "But what should we do when they don't use them?" "I will issue orders which they will have to follow. You just have to build them, I will take care of the rest." "All right, if that's the case," Carl said, nodding his head. "There is another matter I want to discuss with you, Your Royal Highness." "You may speak." "The Masons Guild was forced to disband, and now there are many people like me, who all chose to leave King's City. I would like to write a few letters to those Masons who already know where I went and try to recruit them to Border Town. They all have their own area of specialization. For example, for the furnace, Lysia would be the best at it. However, Your Highness, I do not know." "That's no problem at all," Roland said immediately. "I will recruit all the Masons you're able to attract, and they will be paid according to their experience and skills, and they will also have the possibility to enter the town's hall." "Thank you for your generosity." Carl bowed once more, then he left. When the Mason had stepped out of the hall, Roland began to write down his plan for the managing the serfs and how he wanted to disband the slavery system. Border Town's population had already started to rapidly increase with no end in sight, but as long as they had to depend on importing food, the town would be in jeopardy if a natural disaster was to occur or the road to the other cities was cut off. Therefore, in addition to increasing and developing industry, development in the area of agriculture was an even higher priority. Border Town had to achieve the level of self-sufficiency as soon as possible. The prince believed that as soon as he was able to implement his ideas, the serfs could be turned into farmers, and combined with Lee's improved seeds, the area around the Shui River would soon become a golden wheat ocean. Regarding the high priority of the toilet, it also had to do with the development of the agriculture. With enough people, land, and seeds, the last thing he still needed was the right kind of fertilizer. Roland certainly knew how troublesome it was to produce fertilizer out of human and animals' excrements. They had to regularly clean the storage pond, but they also had to rely on human manure. In the end, it was clearly inconvenient. But for now he didn't have any clue of how to produce it on industrial level, so for the present, he had to rely on this pure natural and organic fertilizer. At least human-animal manure had already been used for a long time. Even during the 20th century some of the rural areas were still using this traditional fertilization. Many people only had very little knowledge about fertilizer. The vast majority of them just thought that a stool was a dirty thing, and that they should never believe that besides of spreading nausea it could ever have any useful effects. Thus, to cultivate the fields each year, the farmers were still using the 3-rotation system. For it, a piece of arable land would be divided into 3 parts, taking turns for spring sowing, sowing in autumn and resting phase. All this was done to avoid the depletion of soil fertility due to constant use. Chapter 126 Wheat Transformation. For villages and small towns, it didn't matter whether or not they used the rotation farming system. However, for big cities where the surrounding land was scarce, this system wasted a lot of land. For example, Silver City, Fallen Dragon Ridge, and King City were such places, so every month they had to import a large amounts of grain from other cities. The first step in using fertilizer was to collect the manure. This was also the reason why Roland decided to establish the public toilets as soon as possible. With the toilets, he could reduce the spreading of disease and even beautify the living environment. It was such a simple action, but it offered so many improvements. His goal was for the toilets to already be constructed by the time the rest of the new citizens have been shipped over. As for teaching them how to use compost and cultivate the arable land, Roland decided to select a small group of experienced farmers during the next few days and teach them the system first. After all, the land was still in its cleanup phase, and it would still need at least a week before it would be usable. After finishing all the work at hand, he decided to go meet Lise at the back garden and take a look at her experiments. Since Lise improved all categories of seeds, there could be seen many different kinds of crops in the garden. She has also followed Roland's suggestion and divided her farming area into several small blocks which were all given a number. With this, she could compare the developments of 2 groups of test crops. When Roland stepped into the yard, he was stunned by the picture of golden and dazzling wheat swaying in the wind in front of his eyes. "Your Royal Highness." When Lise, who was squatting beside one of her fields, became aware of the prince, she immediately stood up and bowed in greeting. "Are these the results of your improvements?" He waved his hand, trying to stop Lise from going through the ritual greeting, went then to pick one of the wheat plants, feeling the caryopsis with his fingers. Previously he had no idea what the wheat would look like, but in contrast with the wheat fields in the prince's former memories, those were not only smaller than the ones in his hand, they also had a lot fewer grains. Lise nodded in acknowledgement. "I let the wheat grow with my magic, then I harvested the ripe seeds and then planted the seeds once more. What you have in your hands is the result I got out of it. However, I repeated this process several times, but after 2 or 3 rounds of planting, it became difficult to grow the wheat as long and large as before, and I just can't understand where the problem lies." "Unfortunately, I cannot help you with that," Roland thought. According to his own pitiful junior high school biology knowledge, it was probably because of self-intersection defects. In the southern area there were only rice seeds, which were poles apart from wheat. So in order to raise the output they always had to purchase new seeds. But even with only 2 generations of planting it still had a practical value. After all, one wheat plant can produce more than 130 seeds, and if he'd let leaves first transform the generation of seeds, and afterward let the farmers use those seeds, he could still use the seeds for 2 years. "Why is this one empty?" Roland asked when he noticed a field with only a few dry straws. "This is the area where I planted first, but perhaps because I had planted here too many cycles," Lise was clearly unsure. I can only let the plants grow when I cast my magic, but when I remove my magic they will wither soon after. It seems that even when she used her magic to let the plants grow she still used up the land's supply of nutrition, and without the nutrition, the plants could not survive. Roland went to the last flower bed. There the planted wheat had a very strange shape, on an arm-thick stalk of wheat with several blue grain ears, and the center stalk even had several branches which were with green leaves. So, the volume of grains per plant were very large, but on the whole field, there were only 2 plants. This was the area Roland has asked leaves to create new plants like a wheat tree. He had envisioned to turn a wheat plant into something similar to a banana tree, where he could harvest the fruit from the branches, with the possibility of a regular harvest, thus eliminating the need for sowing, and if they could grow even larger, they would get more green leaves, improving the photosynthesis and reducing the land requirements. But at present, the thick and solid wheat stalks together with its branches took a lot of space. Furthermore, the grain ears would only grow on the top of the stalks and branches, which weren't what he had originally imagined. Perhaps, should I ask leaves to transform them in the direction of grapevines? Roland thought. After all, leaves had never seen real banana trees, but grapes were not a rare product within the kingdom of Grey Castle, and as long as she had an image it should be easy for to imitate. The seeds of these 3 wheat plants cannot be used for sowing, Leaves explained. I tried already, but the seeds wouldn't germinate after they were planted. However, they can still be harvested several times. You see, the grains are the second batch. Can't germinate means that every plant would be a unique wheat tree and that Leaves would have to personally create every tree, so for the current situation, it doesn't have any true value. You have done a great job. The wheat plant with the big grain ear will be called Golden One. I will create a test field for you south of the Shui River. It will be surrounded by fences and clapboards, to hide it from the view of other people. There I hope we will soon harvest a batch of golden ones. As for the garden, you can continue to use it to improve and create new wheat varieties. I also came up with a lot of new ideas, not only for the wheat crops but also for the grapes, said Roland. Unfortunately, Leaves only has a macro-level understanding of the characteristics of a crop, so she can only change it to get more fruits, sweeter taste, denser branches, and so on. If she could understand it on a micro level, she wouldn't only be able to manipulate the genes, wouldn't she also be able to fine-tune it? Such that the plants could even absorb light other than from the visible spectrum, such as ultraviolet, X-rays, and even ionizing radiation for photosynthesis, getting a direct output of starch, glucose, sucrose, and other energy storage substances, so that we could directly harvest what is needed. During the evening, the 4th prince lit a bonfire near the Shui River, and let Carter and his guards gather all the serfs together. A huge cauldron with more than 128-liter capacity was brought over and placed on the frame of a new simple mud stove, to cook congee over the fire. With the fire at his back, the serfs could only see the narrow image of their new lord, and the moment they became aware of him they would fearfully lower their heads. Only some of them were bold enough to secretly glance at the prince from time to time. Roland, who stood in front of the bonfire, began to announce his new rules to the crowd of more than 1,000 people. I am Roland Wimbledon, the 4th prince of the kingdom of Grey Castle, the lord of Border Town, and the ruler of the Western Territories. Today you were all summoned here. The day that you came to my territory was your lucky day. As long as you work hard, you can break away from your current status and place. That is right, I will give you a chance to get rid of your status as slaves, becoming free people. Hearing this within the serfs an uproar broke out. The serfs clearly knew what a status as a free person meant. They could no longer be cruelly abused by their owners, without any rest, always forced to carry on farming endlessly, and they would no longer have to turn over the crops they produced on their fields to their owners. Their sons and daughters would no longer be turned into the next generation of serfs. Roland waited for a moment to let them calm down, then he continued, from tomorrow onward, each of you will get a fixed field assigned to him, and at the same time someone will guide you in the process to get a better harvest. In the first year, 30% of your harvest will belong to you, while the other 70% will belong to Border Town. The people who get the best harvest results will be promoted to free people. After becoming a freeman, your family will be exempted from slavery, and then you can decide if you want to continue farming or if you want to find another occupation in the town. It will be your own decision. If you choose to continue farming, 20% of your harvest will belong to border town as rent, while the other 80% will belong to yourself. Later you can buy the land from the Lord and then you will no longer have to transfer any food to the castle. After his last word faded away, only the sound of breathing could be heard, until someone shouted, "Your Royal Highness, was what you said was really the truth?" "Of course," Roland answered, stressing every word. "As a lord, I would never deceive my own people." "His Royal Highness is merciful," some people couldn't help themselves from saying out loud. Then the sound quickly became louder, "Long live His Royal Highness the Prince." Suddenly the first serf in front of him kneeled down, followed soon by the second person, then the third person. Until the whole mass of people kneeled in front of him, still calling his name, getting louder and louder. Until the thousands of voices turned into the same rhythm, "His Royal Highness the Prince. Long live the Prince." Hearing the crowd so clearly understanding his intent, there was no need for him to drag things out for any longer, the prince thought to himself. He clapped his hands then said to the bodyguard behind him, "Bring the meal." Chapter 127 Wendy. When Roland fell asleep, Nightingale emerged out of the fog, stepped to the side of his bed and gently straightening the quilt, covering an exposed arm. Then for a moment she quietly stood beside the bed watching the sleeping Roland. She then quietly slid through the floor, back to her own room. "You're not already asleep?" Seeing Wendy sitting on the bed and reading, Nightingale was slightly surprised. "I'm afraid you would do something stupid." Wendy glared at her. "His Royal Highness is not a child. Is it really necessary for you to take care of him until he finally fell asleep?" Original and most up-to-date translations are posted at Ballery Translations. "His Royal Highness has sent people to other towns to spread the news that the Witch Cooperation Association is here, so I have to be at his side in the case someone heard the news of the witches and now wants to harm His Highness." Nightingale picked up a wet towel and cleaned her face with it, followed by unlocking the red belt around her hip, taking off the bands of her leather wrist and body armor, then finally slipped out of her white clothes. This dress was His Highness' newest creation. With a pure white hood coat she wouldn't gather too much attention and thus it was the right clothes for an assassin, at least it was what he thought. Nightingale carefully hung up her clothes, smoothed out every fold. Afterward, she wrapped her sexy and curvy body within a piece of light muslin. On her flat stomach and thighs not even a single trace of fat could be seen. "There is no possibility an accident could happen," said Wendy, putting down the book. "There are sisters within the castle and their guards outside patrolling and furthermore, didn't you yourself put a stone under his pillow? I can never understand how you can touch such a thing." "Well, I'm still responsible for ensuring his safety," Nightingale said while sitting down on the edge of the bed, taking off her boots and revealing her young and slender legs, then laying down and turning in Wendy's direction. "Didn't you listen to what I said last time?" Wendy sighed. "Veronica, we are witches." "I know, Wendy," Nightingale nodded. "Yes, we are witches. And His Royal Highness said that he will marry a witch." This came out of his own mouth, and it wasn't a lie. Of course, this information could not be told lightly, it could only be used as a last resort, so Nightingale didn't give it away. Within her heart, she said sorry to Wendy and then changed the subject. "What's your impression of the church?" "Why would you suddenly ask this?" Hearing this question Wendy clearly became startled. "When I was at His Highness' side in the Stronghold's castle, the high priest paid him a visit and offered to support him in conquering the throne." "How did he answer?" Wendy's voice became strained. "Or did he order you to leave previously to the start of the conversation?" Nightingale smiled and shook her head, softly saying, "He just asked me to avoid the range of the other side's god stone of retaliation, and His Royal Highness didn't wear that thing himself." "Wendy, His Highness did not agree to the invitation of the church, he refused their offer." The latter clearly felt relieved, then she said with a bit melancholy, "Unfortunately, our help to His Highness is limited, unlike the church, whose forces cover the entire continent. If His Royal Highness took their offer, I'm afraid he would soon be able to sit on the throne. Only God knows." His Highness said the high priest spoke only a mouthful of baloney, that no one should trust him. Nightingale paused. There was another important matter. Original and most up-to-date translations are posted at Ballery Translations. Taking out the red and black pills, in the fog, the pills have the same color as the god stone of retaliation. This is inconceivable. Both of us know that the sisters who were discovered to be witches would swallow the god stone of retaliation, which is no different from committing suicide. The high priest said that the pills were produced inside the prayer room in the holy city, and I remember that you used to live there in a monastery. Did you have ever heard of such an organization? Wendy had helped Nightingale to leave Silver City, and during their run, she had set up traps for the bounty-hungry villains who were following them. At the same time, it was also a kind of revenge. One method was to force them to swallow their own god stone of retaliation. After swallowing, the villain would soon die. The whole body would roll up like it was suffering from dehydration, and would look like a fish exposed to the scorching sun. I never heard of something like that. Wendy closed her eyes and began slowly to tell. Since the first moment I can remember, I've lived in a monastery in the old holy city, surrounded by high walls, with no view of the sky beyond. Everything was taught to us with hospitality by the nuns, things like reading and writing or the understanding of maps. I still remember the name of my teacher, Faria. She once gave us a book to read. It was the special introduction about the old holy city. There were churches in the city, monasteries, libraries, memorial halls, and heroic walls, but I have never heard of a prayer room in the city. I lived in the monastery for more than 10 years, until the accident happened. Wendy had already previously mentioned to Nightingale that the monastery was one day attacked by a witch, and many people also died during that attack. Taking advantage of the whole chaos, Wendy was able to get out of the monastery. Also, I don't know which witch had so much courage to dare to challenge the church alone, but she saved you at least. No, Veronica, the witch came from inside the church. Wendy shook her head. She was, like me, a member of the monastery. What do you mean? The girls living in the monastery could be divided into 3 groups. One group consisted out of people like me, who stayed from early age in the monastery, not knowing their own origins. One were orphans who lived on the streets and were adopted by the local church and afterwards sent to the monastery, and the last group consisted out of girls sold to the church by their own parents. We were all separated by age and placed into different quarters, and even the teaching wasn't the same. From an early age onward we learned how to recognize the words. From 10 to 14 years old we studied carols, and after 14 we were schooled in etiquette. The early classes were called the literacy class by the nuns, and the older classes were called the choir class and the ceremony class. Once we became adults we would be sent away from the monastery. This was the first time that Nightingale heard the other speaking about this. Before, Wendy had never elaborated on her experience during her life in the monastery. During the first few years, I could often hear other girls screaming during the night. The screams came out of the direction of the choir classes and ceremony classes. I didn't understand what was going on until I was old enough to get into the choir classes. Then I found out that during the nights higher ranks of the church would visit the dormitory, always dragging a few girls out of their beds, and only at daybreak the next day would they be sent back. But sometimes, not all of the girls would come back again. Nightingale clenched her lips. Of course, she clearly knew what Wendy meant. This kind of thing would happen once or twice a month, frequently even 2 days successively. Then it was the day that I was selected. It was Faria who pulled me out of the room, whispering all the while into my ear that I should just bear with it, everything would become well. I was dragged by her into the corner of the garden where a room was built halfway underground. The room was brightly lit. At one side I could see how the females of the ceremony class being tortured. There were 4 to 5 men. Her voice slightly shook. When they came over to me, one of the women suddenly broke out from her shackles, grabbing the man closest to her, grabbed him by the neck and killing him just like he was a chicken, easily twisting his neck. She had awakened? Reading anywhere else than Ballery translation, you're stealing the translator's livelihood. I do not know. Wendy shook her head. Those men had taken off their clothes, but they still wore their god stone of retaliation around their necks, but she was still able to kill one after another. One of them she seemed to want to skin alive, tearing one limb off after another, while he was still living. The last words he said before his death were, An extraordinary. The screams of the men alerted the guards and Faria who stood outside of the room. They immediately opened the iron gate and rushed in, but the scene in front of them rooted them on the spot, while the other woman directly rushed in their direction. Was she a witch? Asked Nightingale thrilled. Were the guards also not an opponent for her? The gap was simply too great. I later learned that those guards belonged to the army of judges. One of them blew his whistle while the other drew his sword. However, when the first one stopped blowing his whistle, she had already stepped in front of him and penetrated his chest with her arm. In front of her, their armors were nothing more than a thin piece of paper. Chapter 128 Pill Test. Then, she picked up the judge's sword, stabbed Farisa, and split the other judge into two halves, even cutting the guard's sword in two. However, the whistle had alerted the whole monastery. Many guards carrying oil lamps were on their way to us. She then peeled off Farisa's clothes and wore them herself, then took another man's weapon and walked in the direction of the Russian guards by herself. I sat in the room full of a bloody mess for a while before I finally recovered. I discovered that one of the dead men was in charge of the keys to the entrance of the monastery, so I went over and dug out the keys from the scattered clothes. At the same time, I also stripped the stones around their necks. I didn't know what effects they had. I only thought I might be able to sell them for a little money with their crystal clear appearance. The nuns of the monastery, the guards, and the judges were all attracted by that other woman, and so I could get to the hidden back door without being noticed. There, I had to try several keys before I finally found the right key to open the door and flee from the monastery. Later, I was only able to sell one stone because the rest of them were snatched away from me. Thus I had to rely on the 10 silver royals I'd gotten for the one stone during my journey. 2 years later, I reached the Seawind region and had to stop. It was also the time of my awakening. Wendy paused for a while. That's my whole story. Nightingale just silently held Wendy's hands for a long while, until she asked, what happened to the other women in the church? Perhaps they all died, or they were able to escape just like me. I had asked around, but I only learned that the church had said that there was a fire in the monastery and that they had to shut it down. Now one knew it, and even more, no one cared what had happened to the girls. They had all just been abandoned. Nightingale used a soothing voice while holding Wendy in her arms. Now you have us. Everything will become well, so sleep, Wendy. After a long time, she finally heard a gentle, ah. Asterisk. The next morning, Roland entered his office while yawning. There he saw Nightingale as always sitting by his table, but this time she had a serious expression on her face. Well, what happened? Have you ever heard of something called an extraordinary? She asked. Seeing the prince shaking his head, Nightingale repeated the story she had heard yesterday from Wendy. If she hadn't had her awakening, I can't imagine a young woman who could so easily decapitate a heavily armed judge. A witch who isn't influenced by the god stone of retaliation. After listening to Roland thought for a while about what she had heard from Wendy, he started thinking about his own categorizing of the witch abilities. Maybe she belonged to the type of self-enforcing witches? What type? Roland took out a piece of paper from his drawer and handed it over to her. I made a basic classification of your abilities based on the way you use your magic. A self-enforcing type which constantly consumed her magic power and strengthens herself. Although all witches gets their physical fitness improved due to their magic, the self-enforcing type which is much more powerful in this aspect. If I have it right, then Scroll should also belong in the category of extraordinary in the eyes of the church. Scroll? Nightingale couldn't believe it, but she is not good at fighting. True, Roland finished her sentence amused. This classification doesn't judge the personal strength of a witch and also isn't necessarily correct. They are only my personal thoughts and speculations. As a self-enforcing type witch, she really could cause a lot of trouble to the church. Without the protection of the god stone of retaliation, she could easily kill a squad of judges, or single-handedly destroy the church of a small town. But in the end, a person's power is still limited, and the ratio of witches awakened to a self-enforcing ability is much smaller than the other two types, otherwise it would be witches who would be hunting the believers of the church. Though he had spoken with ease, but when thinking about the red and black pills, he still had a vague feeling of unease. There were clearly only a few extraordinary class witches. During the last hundreds of years, there can't be more than a dozen, right? As long as there were 2 or 3 self-enhancing types, they could easily cause great chaos for the church. For example, they could easily take advantage of the annual months of demons. During this time the church would focus all of their energy on defending Hermes, so they could attack the church's facilities in other cities such as churches, priests, nuns, and then kill all of them. So after repeating it for several years, the church's number of followers would have been greatly reduced. However, in addition to Wendy's encounter with the extraordinary, Roland had never heard of a witch counterattack the church. Moreover, the home during Wendy's childhood was set on fire and the whereabouts of all the nuns and women were unknown. The church would never sit still, he thought. Perhaps they have already discovered a means against the extraordinary class, and maybe those 2 pills were part of it. No matter what, he had to test those pills first. Coming to this conclusion, Roland called for one of his guards, sending him to the jails and get one of the prisoners together with Carter. He placed the test site outside of the city walls. Just in case, Roland transferred over 4 members of the First Army to surround the test site, fully armed and always alerted. In addition to him and Nightingale, there was also Anna and Nana on station by the wall. As long as the other one didn't have a godstone of retaliation, Anna's wall of green fire would be enough to guarantee their own safety while Nana could provide the most efficient kind of treatment. You won't have any problem, right? Roland, leaning forward over the edge of the wall, asked Carter, who was standing at the bottom of the wall. Don't look down on your opponent. Your Highness, my rank as a knight isn't only for show, Carter said before placing a helmet on top of his head. Furthermore, my opponent only has a wooden sword, he can't hurt me at all. The test subject was a murder and robbery and for this sentence to death. Even so, Roland didn't like to use him as a test object. So, he bluntly offered the prisoner that in the case that he took part in the test, his family would get 5 gold royals as remuneration. The other side hesitated for only a moment, before he immediately agreed to the condition. Carter had hoped that the other side would also put on an armor and would also pick up an iron sword so that he could have a fair contest, but Roland had refused without any hesitation. If the murder had a sharp weapon, the danger would be multiplied, and if he was to cut off Carter's head, even Nana would have no way of saving his life. As for the reason that he wasn't wearing any armor, it was to test if the black pill really enhanced tolerance to pain. The prisoner swallowed the 2 pills, and the expression on his face quickly changed. The veins on his forehead and arms all turned blue, while his skin turned a deep red and his breathing started to race. He grabbed the wooden sword, calmly waiting for the knight to react, then suddenly, he dashed forward. His speed was comparable to a running wolf, and every time he stepped on the ground, small pits would be dug into the soil. Seeing this, even Carter was clearly shocked, but he still unhurriedly stepped to the side, while at the same time delivering a crosscut. This move forced his enemy to change his direction, otherwise, his rib cage would be cut open. However, his opponent was still just a very vicious murderer. He hadn't undergone any combat training. So, he was caught by surprise, getting a deep cut in his chest area, out of which a huge amount of blood started to pour out. Such injuries were enough to affect the activity of half of his body, but he still didn't show any sign that he cared about it. He just turned into the knight's direction. He tried the same tactic as before, yet this time he changed it a little. The moment they passed each other, the prisoner stretched one arm towards the knight's sword hand. In this awkward position he was unable to use much power, but the moment Carter swept out with his sword he could only see the shadow of the murderer. He subconsciously moved the sword into a parrying position, and was immediately hit by a strong force, which pushed him 2 steps back. The moment the wooden sword crashed into the iron sword, it immediately shattered into many pieces. That only took a little more effort of me. Carter shook his numbed hand. Give him another sword so that he can come again. The prisoner did not take the offered sword. Instead, he suddenly turned around, and directly rushing in the direction of the concealing forest, in the blink of an eye he was already out of Carter's reach. His speed was comparable with a galloping horse, and he was unable to be caught by an ordinary person. The murderer stretched his arms in front of himself, running directly into the body of a soldier who was prepared to shoot, and pushed him to the side. The soldier let out a wretched cry and was sent flying. At this moment, the other soldiers were finally able to pull the trigger. The prisoner was clearly hit and also left some blood behind, but his speed was still not reduced in the least. He quickly broke out of the encirclement, and after a few seconds he had already covered a distance of several tens of meters. "Do not let him run," Carter shouted, "get me my horse." Before Carter had even the chance to jump on his horse, the prisoner suddenly stood still, and stared with an incredulously look at his abdomen. There a horizontal cut had cut his abdominal cavity wide open, and his intestines started falling out. He slowly turned his gaze to his back, only to see a woman completely in white standing behind him, holding a silver dagger in her hands. He had no idea where she suddenly came out from. Chapter 129. The evening course starts again. Nana quickly healed the injured soldier. Something like a fracture was easy for her to heal. Afterwards, Roland let the First Army return to the camp. Only the chief knight, the witches, and several guards were still left at the scene. With a gloomy face, Roland went to the side of the dead murderer, commanding Carter to cut out the bullets. The wounds he had to cut were half a finger deep and the lead balls he found were fractured, indicating that people taking the pills would suffer the same wounds as ordinary people. "Carter, what do you think?" Roland asked. Carter seemed to be a little upset. Most probably he had never expected to be outmaneuvered by a person who had never received any training in swordsmanship. He just became stronger and faster. It doesn't seem he realized everything that he could do. I could have cut off his head with the first strike. And if your opponent was a knight? This would, Carter thought. If it was against the kind of knights the Duke had, I could just barely handle them, but against the king's elite knights or the knights of the Coldwind Ridge, I wouldn't have been able to parry even one of their strikes. Roland didn't comment, but he thought, the great experts always think the one with the better skills will win the fencing duel, and perhaps Carter's perception was right, but if they had the same equipment the situation would have dramatically changed. Assuming that the prisoner was also wearing heavy armor, with a helmet and a two-handed sword, Carter wouldn't have necessarily won so easily. The pills didn't only bring a large power upgrade, they are much more multifaceted. They can even carry stronger heavy armors and weapons, can burst out, run faster and have a much longer endurance on the battlefield. Roland felt he had to correct the assumption he had made during his time in Longsong Stronghold, similar to adrenaline. No, this pill was much more terrifying than adrenaline. Hormones only stimulated the body's own potential, but this red pill had clearly allowed the prisoner to break through his limits. Especially the speed and momentum he showed as he tried to flee, it was almost comparable to that of heavy cavalry. The black pill was just as effective. His ribcage was nearly cut open but he didn't show any sign of it hindering him at all. If he was only a normal person, he would have long since lost his will to fight due to the extreme pain. If a civilian with only a strength upgrade and pain reduction was already this powerful, then what would a group of trained knights using it look like? Roland had a feeling of uneasiness when he thought back to the offer the high priest had made. "Your Highness," exclaimed Nightingale suddenly, "look at his skin." The skin of the prisoner's hand had turned from its former red to ash-colored, while at the same time it had a large number of folds, looking just like a snake after it shed its skin. When Roland poked against it with the handle of his knife, he discovered that the skin was no longer solid like a muscle, it was rather totally empty to his touch. After cutting the skin, he saw that the subcutaneous fat had completely turned into mucus and it followed with the muscle atrophying. "It looks just the same as when someone swallows a godstone of retaliation." Nightingale turned to look at him with a serious expression on her face. "The pill is made from the same components as the stone. It's unlikely that just swallowing a stone would result in such a growth of power." Roland thought, so how were they able to do that? It seems that the pills have very strong side effects, and until now it's unclear if it's permanent or if it can be restored. Roland himself was more inclined to the former. If it was the latter, this enhanced version of a drug out of morphine and adrenaline could be called the god of war. As long as they were able to recover and took it in batches, it wouldn't be surprising if the world was dominated by the church. Even if the pills only lasted for a short time, and even if the pills have side effects, it's still better to be on the alert, Roland thought. If the church begins to support Timothy or Garcia with these, I would have to face an army of drugged fighters. Even more disturbing is that the church was even willing to take out such kind of drugs. They didn't seem to care what happens after the reunification of the Kingdom of Grey Castle. How should the new king help them after exploiting this kind of pills? Grey Castle's troops would only become cannon fodder, so the new and old Holy City would have to send out more of their own troops, and with every continuing fight, the army of judges would gradually become worn down. Unless, they have an even stronger card held back and just don't care if something like this was to happen. Coming to this conclusion, Roland could only sigh. With his attack on the Longsong stronghold, he had intended to end his problem of population and capital shortage in Border Town. Afterwards, he could start focusing on developing the education level, the production and the farming process, turning Border Town from a town into a city in a very short time. As for him developing a new weapon systems, he had planned to put it on hold. But now it seems he couldn't stop the development of the First Army, expanding the First Army, increasing the flintlock production and developing new weapons was now back on top of his priority list, for example a breech-loading rifle with a new kind of bullet. The mechanism of a breech-loading rifle was actually quite simple. The cachet for the bullet was also quite easy to produce. He could make it out of paper or a very thin copper case. Only to find for the right powder mixture, Roland still did not have even a trace of a clue. He only knew that the ingredient was called mercury fulminate. According to its literal meaning, the raw materials must have nitric acid and mercury. As for the need to mix it with other materials, he couldn't remember it. Furthermore, it had a special temperature and humidity requirements, so the chance was relatively high that it would explode in one's finger if handled carelessly. So, he decided that it would be better to spend a lot of money to recruit a number of alchemists and give them their own laboratory in a secluded corner of Border Town, where they could ponder over the right mixture. Asterisk. After the dinner, Roland took Anna and Scroll back with him to his office. Now that Border Town financial situation was like a bulging purse, Roland would soon place more than half of his assets into compulsory education, even if it only yields slow results. An industrial society needed a base of educated civilians, rather than the brute force of illiterates. Without universal education, the rise in population could only change into a burden for the population. Taking this in consideration, Roland intended from this day on to take some time each evening to start teaching. Only waiting until Scroll had a basic understanding of natural science, while at the same time the town had almost completed its first batch of literacy tasks. Since Scroll would become the future education pioneer and all-round teacher, Roland naturally taught her everything he had learned during his whole life. While Anna was just added in because of his own preference. Even so, Anna wasn't gifted with an extraordinarily retentive memory, but her desire for knowledge and her self-initiative to learn was the strongest of all witches. He could often see her going through the books in his bookcase. 6 months down, he was afraid that there weren't any books left that she still hasn't read. In addition, her acceptance of new things and her logical way of thinking was also rare in this era. Taking the primary mathematics and physics textbook from Scroll, Roland began to talk about today's teaching content. At the beginning, when Roland taught addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, to a slightly more complex equation calculation, Anna's ability to understand was significantly better than Scroll's. But when they changed to physics, Scroll showed that she could remember Roland's prior explanations word for word, and now only needed to slowly understand it. And Anna as well would also raise some questions from time to time. For example, how elementary particle looked like, why the elementary particle that formed all living things had nothing in common with each other, and so on. Some of the questions Roland could answer, some of them he couldn't. For example, in the end, what is magic? He could only tell them his own speculation that he had previously come up with, that magic may be a kind of energy, similar to electrical energy or thermal energy, but which was only be accessible by witches. But it couldn't be ruled out that after storing this kind of energy it could be even used by ordinary people. Hearing this, Anna had a thoughtful expression. While teaching women, especially such outstanding type of women, time would always fly by fast. Unconsciously, the candles had already been replaced twice, and the new ones were also nearing their end. Suddenly, Roland heard a subtle snore, and when he turned into its direction, he could see Nightingale lying unconscious, asleep on the sofa. Perhaps this kind of lesson is just like a lullaby to her. No longer sheltered by her fog, her completely inelegant sleeping posture was exposed to the three of them. The prince shook his head dumbfounded, decided it was now time to end the class. He took off his coat and gently covered Nightingale, blowing out the candle and with a smile on his face as he led Anna and Scroll out of the room. Chapter 130 Evolution. After the lesson, Anna returned to her own room. She threw a cluster of green flames into a big bucket filled with water, heating the water to a comfortable temperature. When the water was finally hot enough, she stripped naked and lowered herself into the bucket. Every witch that wanted to clean their body would first come to Anna to ask for her help with heating the water. After all, getting hot water from the kitchen up to their rooms was a very troublesome procedure. When His Royal Highness got to know of this arrangement, he was quite surprised. It seemed it was difficult for him to accept that they would repeatedly use the same water. Remembering the expression he made back then, Anna still had to let out a laugh. For the civilian population, it was already very hard to clean their bodies for even once a month, and even then, they would still use the same water several times. It seems he hadn't even noticed how much our lives have already improved since he accepted us witches and gave us a new home to live in. Anna shook her head. His Royal Highness, Roland Wimbledon seems to be well learned in many areas, but in other areas, he is just clumsy. From the stories she had read in her books, shouldn't a prince have participated in every kind of banquet, social activity, and walked through a sea of flowers since his childhood? As a prince, he is allowed to be without learning or skills and can be cowardly and timid before a fight, but at least he should be good at his communication. However, this kind of thought unexpectedly made her feel at ease. His head seems to be filled with a lot of wondrous knowledge, such as the creation and usage of machines powered by steam, and how to calculate the right size of stone that is able to float on water. There was also today's course, where he taught us that the world was actually composed of numerous tiny balls which are all so small that you would need to magnify them thousands of times before you could see them with the naked eye. Because they are all so small, they are everywhere, whether it is a solid material, gas, liquid, people, flowers, or stones. When decomposed to their smallest state, they are all made out of the same material. That's just incredible, Anna thought. How can it be that His Royal Highness knows of these things? Instead of wiping her body dry, she just used her own flame to vaporize the water droplets on her body. She then put on her clothes and took a place at her desk. In the middle of the table there laid a textbook that was written by Roland. Taking advantage of Scroll's ability to create illusions of books for a period of time, Anna had borrowed a copy of his textbook every night so that she could read a little before she went to bed. Within it was all kinds of information. It began with the simplest phenomena in life, like a step-by-step instructional on how to strip an onion, which was in some places even accompanied by some lively and interesting pictures, to the unheard-of novelty knowledge at the later parts in the book. So, the moment Anna opened it and read the first page, it was nearly impossible for her to stop. But in front of the content is also more obvious. The further she came to the end of the book, the harder it was for her to understand. For example, in one section he had written that even the temperature of objects, in other words whether they were cold or hot, was decided by the activity of these small balls he had talked about today. The higher their energy became, the more actively the balls would become and the more heat they would release. If what His Royal Highness had written was right, then it means that my own green flame gets amplified by the motion of these small balls. Over the time the candles were gradually burned down, then reaching their end, the flame just shook twice before they went out. At the same moment the illusion of the book also reached its time limit. The pages and the writing gradually turned transparent, until they disappeared without a trace. Suddenly the whole room was engulfed in darkness before a green flame came to life on top of Anna's fingertips, dispersing the surrounding night. Seeing the empty desktop, a feeling of loss emerged within Anna's heart. She raised her right hand, looking at her magical green flame, which stood motionless at the top of her fingertips. Suddenly she felt the urge to try it out, testing whether everything really was formed out of these small balls. If that was the case, then could her fire get the same characteristics as those small balls? She closed her eyes, trying to form an image how her flame would look like if it was created by the accumulation of countless small particles. Slowly the flame in her hand began to change. It changed from its water droplet-like form into a string, becoming thinner and thinner but at the same time longer and longer until it looked like a long hair. Anna could feel these changes, but it was still far from enough, she thought, comparing a hair to these balls, it was still much too large. I can still make it finer. Even though her mind wanted it, it seemed incredibly hard to change the green flame any further. The light of her flame became dim, like a shivering long and slender light ray. Perhaps not as a cluster, but instead a series of connections. His Royal Highness had said that between the balls that there is a fixed distance between them, perhaps I have to reshape its shape. The flame in Anna's mind fluttered and she could hear a sound like something becoming broken apart. Afterward the flame particles were no longer closely linked but instead were scattered like the stars. The slender green flame on her hand had also disappeared, but in her consciousness, the flame still existed, but it had no longer its initial appearance. In the boundless darkness, most of the stars had perished, the rest of them slowly reunited, one by one they formed a row of swath, until a filament of many stars was formed. The temperature is equal to activity, she thought. The moment she formed this thought, the line began to swing, like someone had pinched into a corner of it, it began to gently flicker. The moment it began to swing, the swinging of filament could no longer be stopped, one ripple followed after another. It seemed as if she was within a world of ripples, there were no longer any clear outlines between objects, around her everything was excitedly rippling and there was no end in sight. The same could be said about magic, she could even feel it. When she extended her finger, pulling at one of the ripples, it was just like her own magic. But when she opened her eyes, everything was calm. Her green flame had disappeared, and she needed a while until her eyes could adapt to the dark room, the desk, wardrobe, candlestick, their shapes emerged one after another out the shadow. Light blue moonlight fell through the window on the floor, giving everything a light grayish color. Everything seemed to be the same as always, there was no change. But in her eyes, the world has become completely different. A black filament appeared in the air in front of her. However, Anna naturally knew that she couldn't really see it, that it was only in her own perception. She took one of the ingots she had always trained with and which laid still on her desk and placed it in front of herself. The black filament wrapped itself around the ingot in accordance with her will, she then quickly pulled it together. Like a hot knife cutting through butter, her filament went through the iron ingot with ease. In Anna's comprehension, the temperature produced by the filament was several times higher than that of her green flame but was limited to a very narrow range. The iron ingot was quickly cut into two parts, and when she took one of it into her hand she saw that the cut line was very smooth, and she could only feel a little heat when placed her finger against the cut line. She then erected the iron ingot on her desk, placed her black filament on top of the ingot, and let it spread out until it was a completely flat string, perpendicular to each other. This was the mathematical knowledge taught by His Highness, using a point as the center, and then use a quill connected to a string and then go one time around the center, they will be able to draw a precise circle. The area of the circle is equal to the length of the string multiplied by itself and multiplied by a fixed constant. Anna controlled her horizontally spread filament and bended it downwards at the ends at a right angle, letting it penetrate through the ingot until it reached the top of the desk. And then she let it gently rotate around the point at the center. Compared with her green flame where she could only adjust the temperature and whole body, the black flame composed of many particles could be turned into any shape and the temperature of each part could be controlled separately. After one revolution, she had cut out the form of a cylinder. Because the cutting line was so small, Anna needed to use a great effort to get the cylinder out. Like before where she had cut the ingot in two, the entire wall of the cutout cylinder was also very smooth. In the moonlight, she could even see the reflection of her own face in it. Chapter 131 The Manifestation of Magic. Early at dawn of the next morning, Roland was woken up by Nightingale, who had stolen his blanket. He remembered that the last time he was woken up this way was when Nana's father had discovered that his daughter had become a witch. So, he sleepily asked while rubbing his eyes, "What's going on? Did we discover a new witch in town?" "No, Your Highness." Nightingale was totally excited. "Anna, her ability has changed." Roland, who at this point wasn't completely awake yet, asked, "Wasn't she already a grown-up?" "Our ability can change even after we become an adult, but until now I have never seen such an amazing kind of magic. It's just like a completely different entity." Nightingale went to the washbasin. "Even Scroll and Wendy have never heard of something like this. Make haste, you have to see it. The others are already waiting for you in the office." Roland casually washed his face, threw some clothes on and went with Nightingale to the second floor and into his office. When he stepped into the room, the eyes of 11 witches immediately focused on him. One of them was Anna, whose eyes were completely swollen, giving the impression that she hadn't gotten any sleep last night. "Who can tell me what happened?" The first one who opened her mouth to speak was Nightingale. "Early this morning I passed by Anna's room and saw her laying her head on the table and sleeping. On the table were also a pile of iron lumps. When I approached her to wake her up I discovered that the magic within her body had turned into," she paused for a moment, seemingly having to think about a way to describe it, "it fused into a fixed shape, like a constantly rotating cube." Roland went to Anna and stopped directly in front of her. There, he carefully examined her all over, but other than seeing that she was clearly tired, he couldn't detect any differences. Then, he noticed the lengthy cylinder standing on the table. It seemed to be made out of iron, but its gray surface was very smooth and the top was also cleanly cut off, dazzling Roland's eyes. This was created by Anna," explained Nightingale. "She made it with her new ability. When a witch awakens to her power, her body will begin to gather magic. At the beginning, the gathered magic looks like a cluster of fog. However, after a few years, it will turn into a colorful whirlpool. For example, Wendy's magic is white while Lee's magic is green." Previously Anna's magic reservoir was already very large and condensed into a dark green whirlpool on her day of adulthood, but now, the magic within her body has become fist-sized, solid and completely opaque. She picked up the quill on his desk and began to draw its outline. "It's almost like that." Although Nightingale's painting skills were very rudimentary, Roland could still distinguish that it had the form of a cube. Roland turned in Anna's direction. "What happened last night?" Hearing this question, Anna began to recount everything from last night. When she finished her story, the other witches were wearing a confused expression on their faces. They were totally unable to understand what these things that were coming out of her mouth, like small balls, vibrations, and connections had to do with the change to her ability. Only Roland's heart had begun to beat faster. In his opinion, magic was a kind of energy, and the witches were its outlets. Magic could endlessly be transformed into different kinds of abilities, and in the end, the witch herself would decide what kind of effect her magic had. It always depended on how the witch manipulated it, or more precisely, it depended on the witch's own imagination. If his guess was right, imagination could have a far-reaching impact on the developing of their abilities. In short, for a person who had never seen an airplane, it would be difficult to think of the idea that a huge iron bird could fly in the air. A person who had never seen the universe naturally didn't know how wide the world was. The height of their own imagination and the breadth of their knowledge limited their use of magic. Each further understanding of the nature of the world had brought great advances in science and technology, so why wouldn't that also be true for the witches' abilities? The deeper their understanding of the world became, the closer their magic and their effect would come to the origin. "Let me see your new abilities," Roland asked, full of curiosity. Anna spread out her arm, and on top of her fingers a black flame appeared out of the thin air. Even when taking a closer look, there was still no difference between the appearance of her flame and that of an ordinary flame, with the exception that it was black and didn't create any light. "So," Roland asked further, "can you change the shape of your black flame?" Anna nodded, and under her control her flame moved down to the top of the desk. Then her naturally shaped black flame turned into a cube. Not giving anyone the chance to react, the block began to spread out and turned into a black sheet-like cloth, covering almost the entire desk, then gathered at the center, gradually changing into a thin, upright line. Roland could not help but touch, only to discover that this long and slender object, resembling a hair, didn't move a single jot. This was simply inconceivable. It seemed to be as hard as steel, but moments later he could easily bend it with his fingers. She could decide if it was flexible or absolutely rigid. A true body didn't exist. Can you make it even thinner? Yes, but then you cannot touch it anymore, said Anna, or else it will easily cut into your hand. But you can still freely control its temperature? Right, and compared to my previous green fire, I can now control it to such a degree that different parts of my flame can have different temperatures. Roland could now somewhat understand what Nightingale meant by completely new ability. Compared to her former green and warm fire, her ability at the moment had become completely different. Describing it as flame-like before wouldn't be appropriate. When Anna accepted the idea that the universe was built out of microscopic particles, her control of the temperature had also achieved a completely new stage after connecting it with particle motion. It was certain that Anna wasn't manipulating the particles the same way she had manipulated the flames before. No matter if it was her original flame, her green flame she got on her day of adulthood, or now her black flame, they were her form of expressing her magic. Although she converted her magic into heat in both methods, the true effect was very different. She is truly a genius. Roland couldn't stop himself from sighing. Anything else than genius, he could not think of a more appropriate adjective. In the same evening of learning new knowledge, she was immediately able to fully comprehend it and apply it to create a new ability. Only very talented people could have this absorptive capacity and way of thinking. Anna's changes also made him more interested in exploring the true nature of the world. Unfortunately, I don't have my own magic, Roland thought. This is definitely my biggest regret after crossing over. After all, within the hearts of most people there is the dream of becoming a superhero, accidentally gaining an incredible power, and walking down a unique path. How much fun would that be? I might know why Anna's ability has changed, Roland spoke aloud, pushing back his regrets and coming back to reality. How has she achieved it? The crowd asked. Through studying. Do you mean something like yesterday's teaching class? Scroll unsurely muttered. That is exactly what I was talking about. Roland began to explain his own speculation again. The understanding of the world can help you improve your ability, or even completely change it. I can also change? Mystery Moon timidly asked. Of course, Roland reassuringly patted her shoulder. If there wasn't a limited number of steam engines, and I hadn't found the rubber, I would have been unable to produce wires, so her ability to create strong magnets would have become very handy. The original purpose behind his action of imparting his knowledge to Scroll was to avoid forgetting what he had learned in his ordinary memory. But now, he had accidentally discovered that knowledge played a big role in forming the effect of the witch's abilities. So, it became necessary that all the witches partake in his evening lessons. Of course, he also understood that not everyone had Anna's outstanding talent. For example, he didn't have the tiniest piece of hope for Nightingale, who always fell asleep during his lessons. He didn't know how many of the witches would cross the difficult path of simply remembering something to completely understanding it, then understanding it to actually using it. Last night you didn't get any sleep, so it would be the best if you got some rest now, Roland said to Anna. I'll take another look at your new ability in 2 days. All right, Anna nodded earnestly. As for the rest of you, he looked to the other witches, from today on, you will all come together in the living room after dinner to start with the basics and learn how to read and write on Mondays to Fridays. Scroll will be your teacher. Author note: if you like this work, you are welcome to help me with your vote. Your support is the greatest motivation for me. Chapter 132 The Night of the Elk Family, Part 1. Prius had already been locked up for 5 days. Although it couldn't be called a cell, after the transformation, there was not much difference between the former house and a cell. The original wooden doors were replaced by wooden railings, all the furniture had been removed from the house, and only a few blankets were left. The only advantage compared to a cell was that the room was clear and that it had neither holes for draft nor rain. In addition to Prius, there were 4 other prisoners. 3 of them belonged to the house of the former Duke, the other belonged to the Wolf family, and Prius himself belonged to the Elk family. What the hell, he really wants to lock us up in here? Shouted one of the Duke's knights, who belonged to the oldest people who have taken part in the battle. The wheat on the fields in my territory haven't even been sown yet. And my woman doesn't know how to manage everything. Your territory? Asked the young knight of the wolf family with a lot of contempt in his voice. Do you really believe that the prince will let you keep your rank as a knight? Even letting you keep your horse, armor, and weapons so that you can start your revenge whenever you feel like? Really, as long as he doesn't send us to the gallows, he can still be considered as a kind person. What did you just say? The old knight stared furiously at him. To tell you the truth, the young knight explained further, the duke did indeed plan to start a rebellion against the throne, and doing so becoming a first-rate convict, taking all of his elite knights with him, and only letting a few stand by the side of his son. As for us, we would naturally be forced by the duke to follow him onto the battlefield. I see that you would really like to die now. Hearing him talk like this, the old knight suddenly went over, picking the young knight and lifting him up, while at the same time clenching his right hand into a fist, already going through the motion to hit him, but suddenly his hand was firmly grasped from behind. Stay your hand, Halon. Do you want that the guards come over? The fist was grasped by a young handsome knight. What he said is right, we were knights under the command of the duke, so if we are to be convicted we are likely to be sentenced to a heavy punishment. Just look at the knight of the elk family, he is waiting calmly for the result, and now look at how you are acting. Do you think you're showing the right kind of demeanor? Prius could immediately recognize this man. He was the star of all of the Longsong Stronghold's knights, Ferlin Eltek, also nicknamed Morning Light. He had captured the hearts of many aristocratic families' young ladies. However, after coming around, he finally settled down and married a civilian, creating a lot of heated discussions. After being mentioned, Prius decided that now wasn't the time to stay quiet, so he said to them, I don't know what will happen to your territories, but I'm certain that the prince won't kill us. Oh, why's that? If he had killed us all in this stronghold, he would have achieved a deterrent effect, but after spending so much effort to bring us to border town, why should he kill us here? To impress the civilians? Prius shook his head. During the battle, we weren't even able to set one foot inside the town. As long as no one attacked them, burning down and looting their houses, the townspeople naturally wouldn't have any extreme hatred against them. Therefore, since the prince didn't kill them during their stay in the stronghold, he also wasn't likely to kill them here in border town. After thinking about this for a moment, the knight called Eltek nodded in confirmation. What you said makes sense. May I have your name, please, Mr. Prius Dessau. Thank you for your encouraging words, Sir Dessau. After he expressed his thanks, Ferlin grasped Halon by his arm and took him back to another corner. The young knight of the wolf family also sat back down, and leaning against the wall and began to hum. He really doesn't seem to be afraid of it, Prius thought, but my staying calm isn't anything other than a facade. Prius knew that he wasn't made out of the things needed to be a knight. He did not inherit his father's bravery, nor his mother's wisdom, and instead of training with the sword he had always preferred to take care of their territory. Raising chicken and ducks, fishing in the pond or doing anything else similar to this. As a knight for the elk family, he was really a helpless case, not to mention killing someone. He didn't even like to participate in hunting. So, during their charges against the defenders of border town, Prius had always kept as far to the back as possible, never expecting to come into a situation where he had to retreat for his life. Hold on, when he thought about the battle he got the feeling that there was something wrong. As the star of the Duke's knight, why was Eltek still able to stay alive? Shouldn't he have been the first line in leading the charge? His Royal Highness wants to see you, a guard suddenly shouted by the door. Sirius Daly, you're the first to come with me. Hearing his name, a young knight jumped up, waved once to say goodbye to the others and left the cell. Hey, we also want to go. Seeing that one of them was allowed to leave, Halon also chased to the door, only to be stopped by the blunt end of the guard's weapon. After locking the door, he turned once more into the direction of the prisoner and coldly said, Do not worry, it won't be long before it will be your turn. Knowing that it was soon time for his own trial, with each passing minute Prius became more and more tense. Damn it, previously the day of the trial couldn't come along fast enough for me, but now that the day has finally arrived, I've become afraid. Prius thought angrily. But he couldn't stop his body from shaking from time to time. Every few moments he would look towards the door, feeling the same as if his first child was soon to be born, feeling hope and panic at the same time. Fortunately, the waiting time wasn't all that long. Probably only half an hour had passed before the guard responsible for escorting the prisoners came again. "Prius Dessau, it's your turn." Panic-stricken, he jumped up, but his feet accidentally tripping about one of the blankets laying on the floor. But Eltek, seeing that, just took a step forward and supported him, stopping him from falling down. Thank you." Prius pressed the words out of his parched throat. "It's nothing much," said his helper with a soothing voice, taking away a lot of Prius' tension. He nodded once more thankfully in Furlan's direction and then followed the guard out of the cell. Leading the way was a young man, who was about 17 years old, was wearing a dark brown leather armor and boots while holding a strange weapon in his hands. "Don't you need to tie my hands together?" Prius asked, confused. "When we locked you up you were already searched thoroughly, so what can you even do without a weapon?" "Where are you going to take me?" "To His Highness's castle." "What's happened to the previous man?" "The knight, how is he?" The guard just shrugged his shoulders and didn't give him an answer. "Well, maybe he doesn't know what happened to him, or it is also possible that he just doesn't want to tell me." When it became clear that he wouldn't get another answer, Prius just closed his mouth. Prius had a very strange feeling as he looked at his escort. The guard dressed and looked like an ordinary civilian, but when he just spoke to the knights he didn't show even a trace of fear. He wasn't even using the most basic form of honorifics. He seems to not understand that during peacetime, we knights can easily decide his life and death. But there was also the expression in his eyes. Prius had looked into the eyes of many people who were always fighting to survive. Their eyes were all stiff and indifferent, just like the eyes of a soulless corpse, but in this young man's eyes, he saw arrogance and pride. It was obviously that he was a civilian, but he was showing the same prideful demeanor as a full-fledged knight. This extreme incongruity confused Prius to the extreme. In the end, what kind of environment was needed in order to give birth to such a person? While walking, Prius viewed his surrounding. Although he had never been to border town before, he had still heard about what a barren and desolate place it was. But the vibrancy he felt from the town stood on the complete opposite end of the image he had previously formed of it. Everywhere on the streets there were people coming and going, always moving at a fast pace, giving the impression as if everyone was busy. From time to time, there were other people dressed in the same way as the young man escorting him. Everyone's face was rosy, full of spirit, and not a bit like people who had just experienced the ordeal of the months of demons. Close to the castle district, he saw an area where more than 100 people had gathered together. It seems this group of people were responsible for the construction of residential houses, but looking at the scale it seemed that they were building more than one. The materials they needed to build the houses were neatly accumulated on the side, and within them, there were also plenty of fired bricks. In general, only the aristocracy would choose to use this more expensive material, but assuming that the building was supposed for a noble, the area built was just too small for nobility. Looking at an already previously built house, he discovered that it was only as large as his family's drawing room. In addition, all those houses were built with the same design. Which aristocracy would like such houses? With his head filled with questions, Prius entered the Lord's castle. Chapter 133 The Night of the Elk Family, Part 2. Before he was allowed to enter the parlor, Prius had to once more go through a complete body search. But this time it was a much more detailed search than the previous one. From the top to the bottom, they had touched every possible place in which he could hide a knife, even his saws weren't forgotten. He was then led into the hall and was finally able to see the person responsible for the Duke's defeat, the fourth prince of the Kingdom of Grey Castle, the Lord of Border Town, as well as the new Lord of the Western Territories, Roland Wimbledon. The prince carried the typical symbol of the Wimbledon bloodline, the grey hair. His face still looked very young, at most he was still in his early 20s. Besides his grey hair, there wasn't any other sign of his royal blood. He didn't wear a crown nor did he have any other kind of jewelry on his slender fingers, instead he was holding a quill in his hand. Furthermore, he didn't wear any bracelets either. All of this was a very rare sight when facing a member of the aristocracy. "Are you Prius Dessau, a knight belonging to the Elk family?" Roland asked while he leaned back into his chair and looked at the parchment. Yes, sir. When spoken to, Prius knelt down on one knee. He couldn't believe it, such a young man without even the trace of a beard, was able to lead a group of miners and hunters to defeat the whole combined forces of the previous Lord of the Western Territories, Duke Ryan. Are you able to read and write? You may stand up and answer. I can, Your Highness. This is a knight's most basic of requirement. Prius stood up and suddenly thought of some of the old knight who got their title conferred during the time where the kingdom of Greycastle wasn't as powerful. They even knighted civilians with good military achievements, so he quickly added, I mean, like all other knights of the younger generation are able to. Over the past 3 decades, with the reduction in exploration and wars, the possibility of achieving military merits and getting canonized had become smaller, while at the same time other traits became more important for a knight. If you didn't pick up the pen and wasn't able to read or write a document, it would become very difficult to rule over your own territory. With the king's establishment of the camp in the Cold Wind Ridge, the area at the western border of the Kingdom of Dawn had a sudden rise at the number of talented men appearing there. But at the same time, the requirements for being knighted was also placed at a new height. So now during the training to become a knight, the first thing trainees would learn was how to read and write, while later on, if they wanted to rise higher in rank, they would also have to master a variety of etiquettes. But Prius couldn't understand, why had His Royal Highness asked him this question? Very well, the prince nodded. Then it's time for my judgment. Hearing this sentence, Prius instantly held his breath. There are 2 options you can pick from. One is to go to the North Slope mine and mine there for 20 years to redeem your sins, while your second option's it to become a teacher and start to teach my people how to read and write. Furthermore, as a miner you won't be treated as a slave, you will be paid, and every month you will have 3 days of rest. But teachers are not only paid, they will get free housing and 2 days rest each week. However, if you choose the latter option, you must work until you reach the age of 50, only then will you be allowed to lay down your post. By that time though, even if you don't continue working any longer, you will still be paid as usual. After listening to all this, Prius was a little relieved. Sure enough, just like he had expected, they don't have to face death or exile. But these 2 options still left him very puzzled. It sounds like the job as a miner requires a lot of hard work, but His Royal Highness had also said that they would get a salary and holidays? And, as a teacher, wasn't it important to be a knowledgeable person? But besides reading and writing, I have no further knowledge. And what meaning did it have to teach civilians anything? His Royal Highness could not truly believe that he could teach the civilians the complete aristocracy culture, could he? But the most critical point was that both options didn't mention what would happen to his own territory. So, Prius gathered his courage, looked up at the prince, and carefully asked, Your respected Highness, I do not know what will happen to my territory when I chose one of the 2. From the moment you raised the sword against me, your territory no longer belonged to you, answered Roland bluntly. On this point, I have already reached an agreement with the heir of the Elk family, that after you made your choice, the new count will send a compensation together with your family to Border Town, so that your territory is vacant and he can confer the knight's title on someone else. Prius' heart sank. But that is my territory, my house is also on my territory, and there also a group of chickens and ducks and a pond full of fishes. How much can these things be worth? The new count would certainly use a sharp knife to cut it down as far as possible. It was hard to say whether he would even get 30 gold royals for it. The count has just died, and his heir had already abandoned his own family. Such ruthlessness deeply disappointed Prius. As an accomplice of the traitor, who rebelled against the throne, this is just a minor verdict. Roland paused. Moreover, why are you even showing such a large pity for a barren little territory? Whether you choose to become a miner or a teacher, as long as you save enough money you can purchase your own territory. Hearing this sentence, Prius' spirit raised once more. Mining was certainly not his favorite work, but for the other choice. Your Royal Highness, may I get to know how high the salary for a teacher is? As a junior grade teacher, you would get a payment of 20 silver royals each month, with an increase of 5 silver royals per year, until you reach the age of 50. After reaching the age of 50, your salary will be the same like your highest previous salary. However, your job as a teacher cannot be inherited nor can it be transferred. With his little arithmetic knowledge, Prius calculated that he would receive a yearly income of nearly 3 gold royals. Even more, it would increase yearly. So as long as he was able to work for 4 to 5 years, his income would be as high as his own territory's income. Your Royal Highness, what does the title junior grade teacher mean? Are there any other types of teachers? Of course, there are also other occupations. The primary teachers merely teach the reading and writing of characters, while middle grade teachers and high grade teachers are responsible for teaching all kinds of different knowledge. As long as it is a unique skill which is able to help with the development of a border town, you can get the position. Roland sat himself straight up. How is it? Do you have any other good skills? I'm not asking about riding or fencing skills. That doesn't matter since I'm bad at them anyway, Prius thought. He hesitated, but then he said, Your Royal Highness, I'm good at raising chicken and ducks. I am also very good at fishing. The moment he had said it aloud was the moment he already regretted his words. What kind of skill was that? If he was thrown into the wild, he would be able to survive. Other nobles were also raising cats or birds, but wasn't something which interested Prius very much. As for fishing, this was the same as hunting, it could only be counted as his personal hobby. But he would have never believed that His Royal Highness would be so interested into his skills. Oh? How do you raise them? Can you please explain it to me? With no better option than to brace himself and start explaining or to fall, Prius began to state his gathered knowledge. According to my experience in the area of raising broods, it is important to put some grain into the hay, that way they will grow faster. In addition, the grain should be mixed with sand, it will have a similar effect while at the same time saving on food. It would also be good to set a shed in a well-ventilated area, where they are safe from the sun, rain, and the cold. Especially during the hot summer, if there is no shelter, the hen will most likely stop laying its eggs. While during the winter it's important to give them some straw, to avoid the chickens from freezing to death. In addition, if you feed them some small fish every month, the chickens will rarely get sick. Of course, it is also important to clean up the chicken manure regularly. When his speech came to its end, he had to discover that His Highness actually had begun to laugh. Yes, it appears that the aristocracy of the Western Territory truly aren't useless. Your Royal Highness? Prius couldn't understand what the prince meant. Fortunately, Roland Wimbledon quickly lifted his fears. I will send people to buy a group of chickens and ducks from the Longsong stronghold, while at the same time I will also give you a piece of land to the west of Border Town, where you can raise the birds. Your payment will be according to that of a middle-grade teacher. For the first year, you will get 50 silver royals each month, with an annual increase of 10 silvers. Of course, if you fail to raise the birds, your only option left will be the mines. Chapter 134 Morning Light. First, Roland recorded Prius' future treatment on a paper, and he then put down the quill and rubbed his aching neck. Moments later, Nightingale's voice could be heard from behind. Your Royal Highness, would you like me to help you relax? There are still more than 30 other prisoners I have to deal with, maybe later. Roland smiled and nodded in disagreement. He instead took the bell which was placed by the side of his table and rung it a few times. The earlier he finished these chores, the sooner he could start with the Border Town general education task. After seeing Anna's new ability, he was now full of expectation of what the future would hold. The next person who was brought into the hall by his guards was a tall man, and Roland's first impression of him was that he seemed extraordinarily handsome. He wasn't that far off compared to Carter, who had the face of a male god. Of course, in Roland's eyes he immediately got negative points for his handsomeness. After glancing on his list, he asked, Ferlin Eltek? But there was something different between him and other people. Behind his name there were also additional comments, so Roland read further. Head of the Knights of the Lions, Morning Light, First Knight in the Western Territory, you have so many titles. I do, Your Highness. Ferlin acknowledged, at the same time going down on one knee. I thought people like you, the head of the Lions, would be in the first in line during the charge. Roland raised his brow. How were you able to survive? I hid within the rows further behind, admitted the knight. So long as your control over your horse and its step size is good enough, you can let it look like you are in full sprint, while in fact, you haven't raised the speed by much. Roland had never expected that he would get such a straightforward answer. He thought that the other side would try to find some excuse to cover up their own fear of fighting, hiding the fact that they had escaped. It seems that this matter wasn't as simple as he had at first thought. Sure enough, the knight quickly explained his behavior further. On the morning of the third day of your pursuit, in other words, at the day of the Duke's death, I have been standing by his side, trying to find an opportunity to kill him, but he still had a large number of guards by his side, which were tightly surrounding him. So, I did not find the right opportunity to start my assault, but fortunately, your troops were able to kill him in the end. During the whole time he told his story he had held his head down. Your His Highness, I express my gratitude for what you did, so regardless of where you will send me, I will give it my best. The last sentence could be nearly seen as a plea of allegiance, stunning Roland for a moment. When he had finally collected himself he said, "Stand up and explain it to me further. In the end, what has happened between you and the Duke?" "As you command, Your Highness." My wife, Irene, was originally a civilian who worked at a well-known theater in the stronghold. We met each other on a lucky encounter and we immediately fell in love. I had hoped to marry her, but my father and mother did not support the wedding. So, I had to leave the territory and rent a room on a farm near the stronghold. That was also the place where we had held the wedding. However, shortly after our marriage, Irene finally got the opportunity for her first formal performance. Speaking up to hear, the knight's voice became smaller. The Duke also watched the drama and immediately took a fancy to her, and it didn't take long before he broke into our room and assaulted Irene while I was still out on a mission. It took me a long time before I finally got her to tell me what had really happened, and the moment I heard about it, I wanted to find the Duke and hold him responsible for his deeds, but Irene knelt down and begged me not to act recklessly. Deep down, I also knew that if I tried to do something, my chance of success weren't very high. Even if I was able to kill him, I would never be able to escape the hands of his personal guards, and Irene, most likely would become the object of revenge for the Duke's heir. With no other option left to me, I could only suppress my thoughts of revenge, until he decided to go on march against Border Town. Although I wasn't able to take personal revenge, but now Irene will finally be able to fall asleep without having to worry that someone will break into her room during the night. For me it was also a heavy burden which is now finally lifted from my heart, so please allow me to thank you once again. So that's what happened. Roland tapped with his quill on the table, a sign he had previously agreed on with Nightingale, telling her to check whether the other side had lied. Soon he could feel how Nightingale pinched his left scapula, which represented that the other side had told the truth, but this pinch was slightly too hard, letting Roland a little flinch. "Are you able to read and write?" Now it was Furlan's time to get startled, showing that he clearly was unable to follow the prince's train of thoughts. "I can." "Then I'll announce my verdict now." Roland gave him the same choices that he had given to Prius. "What is your choice?" "Your Highness, do you not want me to fight for you? Whether it is a solitary riding duel or a group battle, I dash." "No, I do not," interrupted Roland him. "There are no aristocrats within my army, and in the future, I won't be recruiting any of them. They are a fully armed civilian army, and you yourself, during the rest of your life you won't ever get the opportunity to again take up a weapon." "Yes, so?" Furlan was silent for a long time before he finally nodded. "I understand. That being the case, I choose to become a teacher." "You made a wise choice. Teachers can get free housing and their salary is also very good. I will send someone back to your home, to get your wife, so that you can continue to live a good life here together." After giving his judgment, Roland gave the signal that Furlan could now leave. "Wait, Your Highness, I beg you please let me ask a favor of you." Furlan, however, did not leave. "Did you mean that the other knights, as long as they are unable to become a teacher, the only option left to them is to work in the mines for 20 years? "That's exactly what I said. Your Royal Highness. I have a man named Harlan. He is an experienced and old knight, but he is unable to read. Can I pay for him with gold royals so that he won't be sent into the mine?" Of course not, Roland directly disagreed. If you could redeem your crime with money, you would just go back to the stronghold. But he's almost 50 years old, and this kind of work where he doesn't get to see the light of the day would only destroy his body. He isn't strong enough to mine, but he was still able to attack Border Town. Furthermore, my ore mine isn't such a dark coal mine as you're imaging. I also have a steam engine, which helps with the pumping and transportation, and the staff even have a fixed holiday. Don't you think that's good enough? Roland picked up the bell, ready to call for the next prisoner. My lord. Ferland got frantic and went once more down on his knee. My family has a treasure map, which is at least 400 years old, and I am willing to use that to buy his freedom. A treasure map with an age of more than 400 years, the prince became uncertain. Are you sure that it wasn't one of your ancestors who took some charcoal and casually drew a map to coax the younger generation? No, it's not written with charcoal or ink, the knight shook his head. Then he placed his hand on head as if was trying to recall the drawing. I can't tell you out of what material it is made of. The lines are very delicate, smooth and supple, and it's been stored in our basements for decades, but the drawings and the text don't have any signs of discoloration. My father told me that it was handed down from generation to generation, and it describes the location of a treasure. It should be hidden deep in the northwest of the concealing forest, but to get there you would have to cross past the desolate lands, so to us it was simply impossible to go there. Roland tapped his quill once more against the table, and once more Nightingale pinched his left side. Well, even in the case that what you said was the truth, there is still the problem that this treasure map should be hidden in the basement of your family home. You have already given up the right of your inheritance, and I'm afraid they won't willingly see you ever again. What you say is the truth, he firmly nodded, but I have completely memorized the content of the drawings, the above patterns, and the text. I can roughly depict it. Then draw it for me. Roland pushed his quill and paper over the table into his direction. If what you said is true, I can make an exception to your request. His Royal Highness is too kind. Ferland went to the table and began to depict the treasure map. It was true, Morning Light wasn't only good at fighting, no, he was also talented in painting and calligraphy. Soon, a rough topographical map appeared in front of Roland. The map actually showed the area behind the impassable mountain range. The lower right corner of the map was occupied by mountains. Then around the center, he drew an equilateral triangle, and the three corners pointed to different places. One corner ended at the foot of the northern slope, and another corner pointed to a hexagonal star mark inside the concealing forest, which was most probably the so-called treasure's location. However, Roland's attention was entirely attracted to the third vertex of the triangle, pointing to the middle of the wildlands. On top of a sawtooth-shaped mountain top, stood the word, Tequila. Chapter 135. To start with the basics. The devils grow in number each day, but we become less. The holy city of Tequila has already fallen into the hands of the enemies. The only option left to us is to scatter in all directions. We fled over mountains and across rivers, as far as possible from the gates of hell. But next time, where should we flee? What do you think about it? Back in his office, Roland closed the illusion of the ancient book and turned to Scroll to get her opinion of it. In case what the knight remembered is the truth, this would really be an incredible coincidence. Scroll pondered for a moment about her next words. The content of the treasure map and what's recorded in the ancient book is the same, so this proves that the church had once stepped into the wildlands and constructed a point of resistance against the devils there. In addition, the points marked on the map are perhaps the defense towers, posts, warehouses, or whatever they built there. You mean, this isn't really a treasure map? Of course. After all, the church isn't a group of bandits or pirates. They do not need to hide their treasures, but they would leave behind a drawing to help the future generations. Roland nodded. Well, so, this is just such a map. Although it is not clear why the church did not record this period in history, I believe that the ruins buried in the eastern forest aren't the only one of its kind. Analyzed Scroll, if the locations marked on the map are just some facilities, the chance that we find something after all these centuries aren't that high, but if it has a storage warehouse in the basement, it will probably be another underground site, and we might be able to uncover some clues from it. What kind of clues? Like the reason that the church is concealing the existence of the devils? Why do they resist the devil, but still carefully conceal it? She paused, her voice becoming a little unsteady. And, why do they call us witches the devil's messengers, and why do they want to kill us? Roland did not know how to comfort her, so he was unable to find the right words as he fell silent after a moment. Only after a while he slowly began. Unfortunately, he didn't know how accurate the picture was. According to his statement, the original map wasn't drawn by hand. Do you want Nightingale to go to the knight's house? That doesn't sound right, Roland denied. The treasure map has already been passed on for hundreds of years, so the possibility that the storeroom is filled with God's stones of retaliation or other traps is high. Pointing at the triangle symbol, for now, this place is out of reach, in any case. If this is the area of our North Slope mine, then the location of the hexagonal star is at least 50 kilometers away from us, almost as far as the distance between border town to Longsong Stronghold. With the exception of Lightning, who can travel that distance within a day, the rest of us would need to walk for 2 to 3 days. What will we do if we were to meet some of the devils during the journey? I don't want you to have any kind of mishap. You can let Lightning explore the forest from the air, maybe she will be able to find something, Scroll suggested. That is a viable option. Roland immediately stood up. The next time she comes back I will give her her new mission. But for now I want to go to the North Slope mine while you get ready to give your next lesson. If you need more copies of the books, you should find Soraya, she will handle it for you. Don't forget to continue to give them lessons this evening. Now that Roland had already held the first lessons of his new primary course, he could give the teacher's position to Scroll. With her phonetic reading and writing and her ability to repeat everything from memory she had once heard or read, Roland believed she had everything that was needed to become a good teacher. Yes, Your Highness, Scroll said as she saluted and left. The testing and production area near the North Slope mine was now more than 2 times as large as it was before, and the 2 holes needed for the production of the 12-pound cannon were still left on the ground. When Roland arrived in the testing area, he immediately saw Anna practicing her new ability. On the table next to her, there laid 2 finished products that looked exactly like steel pipes. He immediately held them up to take a closer look. The steel pipes were perfectly round and had a totally smooth surface without any pores. The hole in the middle was equally wide on both sides, and the sunlight passed through without any problems through the hole in the pipe. To compare the thickness of the pipe walls, Roland placed his fingers into the holes. This way, he discovered that they were exactly the same size. Roland couldn't stop admiring her work. How were you able to make this? Take a look. Anna picked up a freshly cut steel bar, laid it flat on her hand, and inserted a thread of her black flame into one end, leading it through the complete body. Then she let the thread rotate around the center of a circle, and soon the hole was complete. What an amazing ability, he thought. With her magic, she is capable of hot wire cutting, and at the same time her accuracy and control are incomparable. Anna alone is enough to push the industrial production to a new height inside border town. Trying to restrain his excitement, he said, "Let's do some basic tests first." The basic test included the testing of the scope of her ability's strength, and its duration. Nightingale also took part in the test. She appeared out of her fog and was responsible for observing if there were any changes to the magic inside of Anna's body. The results showed that in addition to a substantial increase in the strength of her ability and the duration at which she was able to cast her magic, the range at which she was able to use her flame was still around 5 meters, and it was only within a range of 3 meters that she was able to carry out her precise control. Furthermore, her magic still belonged to the category of summoning, and could still be suppressed by God's stone of retaliation. When Anna ordered her black flame to enter the range of the stone, the flame would still suddenly disappear. Unless she could evolve to the point of directly accessing her magic, she wouldn't be able to get past this hurdle. However, Anna's new capabilities still belonged to the category of earth-changing. With her black flame, it became much easier to produce the industrial machinery, and her ability to reproduce all kinds of tools could be considered as the method to push the level of machine processing to a whole new level. However, a large-scale industrial production wasn't something that one person could do on their own. For example, Carl had already finished one of the furnaces he had to build on the hillside near the North Slope mine. However, by the time they tested it, they discovered that although they could use it to produce clay bricks for the creation of cement, its temperature tolerance was not up to the level that they had needed. So, in the end, they still had to rely on Anna alone to produce the required cement. Fortunately, since her day of adulthood, it was no longer required of her to step inside the dusty room to complete the calcining process. It wasn't the case that Roland was unable to find a solution to the temperature problem. For example, they could use the steam engine to create enough wind in order to improve the furnace's temperature, and they could then let the heated-up air circulate to minimize the heat loss. But without Anna, they were unable to create another steam engine. After all, only she could complete the welding of the key components. It could be said that the creation of industrial machinery was built on the Anna's shoulders. The moment they lost her, the so-called Industrial Revolution would be nothing more than flowers in a mirror and the moon reflected in the lake. During the months of the demons, Roland had done everything he could in order to survive, and now that the threat of the demonic beasts no longer existed and Longsong's stronghold had provided them with enough additional population and capital, he naturally wanted to change the present situation. First, let us start with the basics. He let Anna cut out a 2-finger wide and 1 millimeter thick steel sheet. He then measured a centimeter long distance on it, and repeated this until he had a 10 centimeter long ruler. Then he let Anna's black flame climb up the steel sheet, and create vertical marks at a regular distance. Under her fine control, the distance between each vertical mark was almost exactly the same. Roland's intention was that this ruler was only the start. Afterwards, he wanted to create various kinds of measuring tools to define the samples for uniform weights and measures. These standard units would then be written as the norm into manuals, becoming an inseparable part of his educational courses. Chapter 136 The Dilemma. The last 2 weeks in Clearwater Port seemed to be one day of festival after another. Even standing above the ground, on the balcony of the Lord's Tower, Ryan could still feel the exuberant atmosphere within the city. The people and materials they had moved from Eagle City had greatly expanded the strength of the harbor city. The looters had really a fruitful harvest and the slavers haven't been any less successful. After this series of fighting, the Black Sail Fleet not only did not have many losses, they could even increase the ranks of the sailors with new slaves who were currently standing at the edge of the harbor undergoing a rigid drill. In a few days, they would set sails towards the islands of the fjords beginning this year's first looting operation. Her Majesty the Queen has also openly declared the Slave Act. As long as these captured slaves from Eagle City were able to capture new slaves, they could exchange them for their replacement. Like this, they could jump from the rank of a slave to a full citizen of the Clearwater Port. With such a decree of encouragement, they could guarantee that the former residents of Eagle City, who had now become slaves, would do their best to fight for Her Majesty. Today, the defeated Timothy should have returned to King City and shouldn't have any possibility to block the conquest of the Queen of Clearwater. As long as time passes, Garcia Wimbledon was bound to become the Queen of Grey Castle. Thinking of this, Ryan couldn't understand why he didn't see even a small trace of happiness on the Queen's face, but to the contrary, her eyebrows were always forming a frown. Your Majesty, the clan heads of the Sandstone clan and Blackbone clan have come to see you. At this moment, the voice of a guard could be heard through the door. Ryan looked at Her Majesty, only to see that the latter didn't show any sign of listening, so he could only shout, "Bring them in." His Majesty, whether it was to rest, to convene a meeting or just to meet with people, she was always at the top of the tower. As long as the weather was good, the terrace was the place where Garcias could be found. Most people weren't conformable with standing in mid-air, facing the slightly fishy-smelling sea breeze. And the people from the extreme south were no exception to this. The clan head of the Sandstone clan was a petite woman, but she also acted as the clan's own goddess. When Ryan had heard of this for the first time, he had scoffed within his heart, "What goddess? She is nothing more than a corrupted witch." The clan head of the Blackbone clan was a tall man, whose face was covered in scars and whose arms and legs were exceptional muscular. Each meeting, they had to place 3 to 4 guards to surround him, in case he planned to act against Her Majesty the Queen. The moment they set foot on the terrace, the two clan heads invariably raised their eyebrows, but they soon changed their expressions back, and instead they went down on one knee to pay their respect to Her Majesty. May there always be an oasis in front of you, and may the stars of heaven always light your path. Stand up, Garcia said while she herself sat down on the parapet. How is it, are you satisfied with your new home? Everything is fine, answered Goddess Kaba rushed. Here the land has water and forests, which is much more comfortable than the life in Sand City, where the wind blows the sand all over the place. When everything is to your liking, then why did you come to me? Your Majesty, you have to. The moment the Blackbone clan had opened his mouth to speak, he got already interrupted by Kaba. Yes, Your Majesty. After the last battle, many of our warriors became weak and dispirited. Only after a new dose of pills did their symptoms get any better, but we don't have enough pills in our hands. So, we would like to ask you if you could give us more pills. I meant to say the same thing, muffled the Blackbone clan head after he received a glare from Kaba. These pills are very complicated to produce and have rare ingredients. I do not have much surplus. But rest assured, when the new batch of pills is produced, I will give them to you as soon as possible. But don't forget to prepare the gold royals. If they aren't enough, you'll have to pay in other ways. Your Majesty, I beg your pardon for my asking. Kaba hesitated for a moment. I wonder when the next batch will be made. I'm unable to give you this information. Garcia stroked through her hair, sorting the chaos created by the sea breeze. All the news about the pills are top secret. You can only go back and wait patiently. Those soldiers are just dispirited. Just let them rest a little bit more, then everything will be all right. After receiving a hint from Garcia, her guards walked forward to surround the clan heads and lead both of them back down, without giving them any chance to say any more words. When the door closed behind them, Garcia sighed softly. Ryan, who had rarely heard such a tone from the Queen, had to ask, Your Majesty, don't you think that it was wrong to let the Sand People settle down at our southern border? One day, when they become stronger. No, Ryan, Garcia shook her head, I have never been worried about the Sand People. They won't ever be a threat to Clearwater Port. The lake in their territory is exactly in the middle between the two clans, but the river ending in the lake goes first through the port of Clearwater. So as long as I block up the river, the amount of water in the lake will be reduced and they will start to fight against each other. This is also exactly the reason why I chose the Sandstone clan and the Blackbone clan. Their relationship was never harmonious. Then are you worried about the matter of the pills? Garcia didn't give him a reply. However, just at this moment a guard knocked once more on the door and announced, Your Majesty, the priest of the church, Daikar. Bring him in. The Queen stood up and her face became darker. Your Majesty, Garcia Wimbledon, I greet you on behalf of the Holy City. The priest entered the terrace while bowing. Pills? Why is it that the previous batches of pills that had always been served timely, but this batch got so much delayed? Garcia asked coldly. Your Majesty, no need for anger, this is exactly the reason I came. Daikar had to wipe the sweat from his forehead. You asked to buy 5,000 pills, but that is just too much. Even if we take all the pills produced for the Hermes, we can't fulfill your request. This time I brought as much as I could with me. How much? Interrupted Garcia. 1,000. Said Daikar in a consoling voice, the rest will be sent after a while. And it will still be the same as previously promised? Garcia's facial expression got a bit nicer. Now I want to have as many as I can. Also, where have you stored the pills? I'll immediately send someone to fetch them. In the church, the gold royals. This time, I won't reduce the number of gold royals. Garcia stepped directly in front of Daikar and whispered into his ear, but if the delivering of the pills get further delayed, your head will hang on the highest mast of my flagship, and I can guarantee you, the Archbishop won't shed a single tear for you. Hearing this, the priest turned pale and directly asked to be excused. When he had left, Garcia went back to the railing and looked out over the sea. Her hair was lifted up by the sea breeze, just like the flags of her ships, waving in the wind. You were right, I'm worried about the pills. Garcia's voice seemed distant. If Timothy had waited 2 months longer, my preparation would have been more adequate, but he had moved too fast. You've done a great job, Ryan thought to himself, who could have done a better job? The moment she had occupied Eagle City, she had already started to prepare the path for her retreat. She had ordered her soldiers to take away all of the usable materials and residents, while at the same time she let ditches be dug out everywhere in the city, afterward filling them up with black water. Since they had a shortage of manpower, Garcia exchanged the territory between the southern border and the wildland for the support of the Sand People. She then gave the clan warriors some pills and let them attack Timothy's knights from both sides. However, to ensure that her loyal supporters were able to resist the last overwhelming charge, they didn't hesitate for a moment to swallow the secret drugs themselves. The secret medicine provided by the church wasn't like what they had told, allowing alive without any obstructions. After swallowing them once, if they didn't get the next dose fast enough, the medication will turn into poison, letting them become weak and later die in pain because of muscle atrophy. If it were only the Sand People I wouldn't care, but the people who worked for me deserve something better. She paused. Ryan, take some men to receive the pills and distribute them under our heroic warriors. But only use half of them, this way we can last a little longer. Just as you wish, Your Majesty. As Ryan was already halfway to the door, they could hear the guard's voice for the third time through the door. Your Majesty, we have just received a secret letter from King City. Wait a moment, let's read the letter first and then you can go, Garcia ordered. Yes, Your Majesty. Ryan received the letter from the guard, broke the seal, and removed the parchment. Most of these letters contained information sent by the spies hidden in all parts of the country. They were never signed, never had a recipient written on it, and its content was also always as concise and clear as possible normally. But when he saw the first sentence, his whole body was suddenly rooted. On the 22nd day of spring, the church seized the capital of the Kingdom of the Eternal Winter, declaring that the kingdom is now under their rule. Chapter 137 Secret Meeting. When he opened the thick wooden door, the light fragrance of straw hit him in the face. Archbishop Maine liked this mixed smell of herbs and spicy candles, especially in a space which had no windows for ventilation. Every time he smelled this combination of scents, his mind became clear and he felt at peace. The chamber wasn't particularly large, it offered just enough space for one round table and 4 chairs. The other 2 archbishops were already seated on their chairs, while the chair facing the wooden door was still empty. The Pope's physical condition had been deteriorating in recent times. It was almost half a year ago, since the last time he had shown himself in front of anyone. Only for cases that were too difficult to solve by themselves would he leave Hermes' underground castle, seeking the answers for himself. It seems everyone is there, so let's get started, Maine announced. He then bolted the door and sat between the other 2. Archbishop Taifun, what are the last reports from the Kingdom of Eternal Winter? Besides some former nobles, there are only a few other places where they still rebel against our rule. Au contraire, it seems the civilians are even welcoming us to take over the kingdom. Taifun explained while stroking his beard. Of course, those stubborn nobles, holding on to the dreams of their past glory, will be eradicated soon enough. That sounds really good. Heather licked her lips. In the case that you let me hold the next trial, the civilians will all become more aware of how ugly and dirty the former nobility were, but unfortunately, I still have a lot of things I still have to do here, so I can't go to the Kingdoms of Eternal Winter's King City. Maine ignored her words, and instead spoke to Taifun. We have to fill those vacant positions of power, as soon as possible with our own people. During the years that have passed, the church has trained a lot of skilled people and now the time has finally arrived that we can use them. However, the Kingdom of Eternal Winter has forever been the kingdom in which our church had the biggest influence, but if we are able to ride on this wave, we will be able to handle the Wolfshark Kingdom and the Kingdom of Dawn a lot sooner. That seems only natural. What should happen with the nobility who have always relied on the church, or to the ones who always turns in the direction the wind blows? Heather asked. The reason why the church was able to attract so many good believers was because we didn't ask for their lineage, but for their actual skills. However, those idiots would shake the foundation of our entire church, so my idea is, she made a gesture of slicing open her neck. In the beginning we still have to use them, to reduce the resistance we received, but after the kingdom has become stable, we can talk about them then. Regarding this point, they had deliberately decided to ask the Pope. The Church can provide them with the same authority equivalent to their title, but this position cannot be inherited by their future generations. After all, our end goal is to destroy the kingship, so don't be anxious for the moment, Lady Heather. Heather had been born poor, and before she had been accepted by the Church, she had suffered from hunger and living a homeless life. But with a naturally keen mind and gift of extraordinary judgment of the human character, she had climbed up in the ranks until she had reached the position she held today. Mayne was well aware of her dislike for the nobility, but for the moment it was more important to look at the overall situation. What is the actual situation within the Kingdom of Grey Castle? Mayne asked. Our spy network reported that after his defeat, King Timothy didn't come back to King City and instead went to directly stay within the Eastern Territory. Replied Teflon. A smart choice, Heather snapped her fingers. He has taken Duke Francis with him to challenge the Queen of Clearwater, yet the Duke died during their attack and now he immediately went back to the east and divided the Duke's territory to stabilize the morale of his soldiers and at the same time to win over the other nobles. The royal family doesn't only consist of fools. In this way, we can save a lot of trouble. Let the High Priest of the Kingdom of Grey Castle get in contact with him. Timothy's situation has become so precarious, he won't be able to refuse our offer. We will reduce Port of Clearwater's drug supply by 30% and with this balancing the strength between those two. This situation will be handled by you, Teflon, Mayne decided. After 2 years there won't be any soldiers in the kingdom left to stop our conquest. You can rest assured, Teflon nodded. But, there is something wrong with the situation at the Longsong stronghold in the Western Territory. What is the problem? The fourth Prince Roland, after his victory against Duke Ryan, he immediately went back to Border Town, and furthermore he didn't answer to High Priest Taylor's offer. Doesn't he have any intention of fighting for the throne? Well, what are your thoughts about it? Mayne asked while looking in Heather's direction. The latter just shrugged. What else can I say? What were the rumors about him again? He has a nasty character, is incompetent, has neither any learning nor skills to speak of, and he's also known to be greedy. How was it possible that such a person could win against the Longsong stronghold? The answer to this question is very simple. He deceived everyone, whether it was the other nobles or us. You mean, Mayne frowned. We have chosen the wrong person, Lord Mayne, she sneered. He is the one who should have been on the main stage, not the three our Princes Garcia. That he was able to defeat the Duke truly showed his talent, but even if he was such a skilled person, without the resources he will be unable to fully display his skills. Teflon shook his head in disagreement. Since he chose to return to that piece of desolate earth, it seems that he has given up on his chance to reach the throne, and because of this he won't be causing any threat to our plan. That seems to be correct, theoretically. But there is another interesting piece of information you shouldn't overlook either. Heather threw out a note. This information was something I gathered with my personal eyes. Mayne spread open the note and quickly swept through its contents. Which? They're one of those witch organizations. They call themselves the Witch Cooperation Association and claim for themselves to have a firm foothold in Border Town and now ask other sisters to also gather there. While this is only hearsay and could be a groundless accusation, but this doesn't seem to be the case. We already know that the name isn't fictional. We have already sent our army of judges against them once, and after their defeat in the Eastern Forest, they crossed over the whole country, only to ultimately disappear somewhere west of Longsong Stronghold. Border Town is just west of Longsong Stronghold, directly next to the kingdom's border and the foot of the impassable mountain range. Two important powers situated at the same location. Isn't that a little too much of a coincidence? Witch Cooperation Association. I also have some impression of that name. During their whole journey they often had to face the army of judges, and even after losing a lot of their staff they still insisted on moving in the direction of the impassable mountain range. According to the information gathered from some of the tortured witches, it seemed they wanted to find the Holy Mountain, located somewhere to the west of the mountain range. It was just a suicidal move, so we did not put much energy into this matter. There are even similar witch organizations within the Kingdom of Dawn and the Wolfshark Kingdom. They are always lurking within the cities, and after some time they suddenly rush in the direction of the wildlands, only to throw away their lives against an even stronger threat. You mean, the prince and the witch organization both hooked up? After reading the news, Tayfun's face became a lot darker. Maybe, maybe not. Heather smiled. That is only a simple guess on my part. What do the witches fear the most? Exposure. And it is obvious that they will draw all the more attention when they use the name of their Witch Cooperation Association, but they still use the name for their underground message. Why is that? Because it's a familiar name to us, Maine said quietly. However, that's also the same for the other witches. Full marks, exclaimed Heather, clapping her hands. This will effectively reduce the wild witch's wariness. Perhaps there will really be someone who could be attracted by this news and decides to go to Border Town to explore what the actual situation might be. It's not hard to imagine this, since Border Town is without any member of the church to overlook them, they would perhaps dare to do such a thing. We often say that it's better to choose the lesser of two evils. Obviously, the other side has considered this and decided that the consequences of being unable to recruit witches is more serious than the consequences of them being exposed. Here her voice became gloomy, and I don't like the feeling of being underestimated. This isn't a small problem, Teflon wrote angrily. Once the witches have settled down, they will be able to fully display their capabilities without any fear. It's also very likely that the so-called demon phage can also be avoided. This is exactly the reason why we encircle every settled-down witch. Only when we can force them into hiding or let them run into the exile, are we able to keep it a secret from them. Maine knew that the Teflon side of the argument was right. A witch alone wasn't a real threat to the church, but as a group, it was a completely different matter altogether. And once they got rid of their identity as the devil's messenger, the church's propaganda would soon be exposed, resulting in a great loss of influence for them, maybe even shaking the church's foundation. He was now caught in a dilemma as they encountered such a possibility of whether they should send a large number of judges to encircle the witches' base, but in the end Border Town was too far away from Hermes, and furthermore, the church's army should be attacking the Wolfshark Kingdom soon. So, it was now too difficult to split off the manpower that they needed to wipe out this remote town. Coupled with the problem that if they were to send out such a large number of troops into the Kingdom of Grey Castle, it was guaranteed that the nobility of the kingdom and of the other two countries would soon become vigilants, which could lead to a failure of the entire plan overall. After much deliberation, they finally came to a decision. I will send a priest with 10 judges on a mission to Border Town. They should investigate this matter together with the high priest. If the Witch Cooperation Association was acting independently from the prince, the force should be strong enough to eliminate all the witches. But what about if they are related to each other? Heather asked. The God's Punishment Army was only allowed to march if they were led by Maine himself or a few other high-ranking members of the church. This rule had been personally made by the Pope. Remembering this, he answered, then they should bring the news back to us and I will personally lead the God's Punishment Army to march against Border Town. Chapter 138 Establishment of the Ministry of Agriculture. The forest south of the Shershue River had nearly been fully cleared out, and the day to start with its cultivation was getting ever closer. In order to facilitate the people who were crossing over the Shershue River, Roland had commissioned for a nearly 100-meter-long pontoon to be used. The pontoon was created from tens of wooden rafts, which were connected together with thick hemp ropes. He had also specially ordered for the carpenters to build the rafts, both of the ends being pointed, in this way minimizing the amount of water resistance as far as possible. The hemp rope had been tied around 4 wooden pillars on both sides of the river, fixing the rafts positioned together as far as possible. Between each raft laid 4 long planks with one end of it on each deck. They were 2 meters long and together they were 4 meters wide from side to side. A pontoon built out of rafts was very simple to set up, yet its service time wasn't as short as would be expected. As long as the water level didn't rise or fall by too much, which could lead to the wearing out of the hemp rope, the pontoon could easily be used for 2 or 3 years. The trees of the forest was an excellent material. For example, the Border Town's pier was a good indicator and built out of the giant trees of the forest. It was nearly as old as the town itself by now. Despite the fact that walking on top of would give off a creaking sound, it still didn't show any sign that it would collapse. On the western side of the pontoon, the first part of the reclaimed land of the forest became Leaves' testing area. Now that they were no longer surrounded by the forest, it had now been tidally enclosed by the members of the First Army. During these past few days, with the exception of eating, going to school and sleeping, Leaf spent all of her time here inside of her garden. Out of the window in his third-story office, Roland could faintly overlook the scene in this wooden enclosure, where the wheat was growing at a crazy rate, while in the morning there would only be green seedlings, and in the afternoon the whole area has turned into a golden wheat sea. When relying on magic, her golden ones would only need 1 day after being planted to become ready to be harvested. If this was to be seen by an outsiders, they would surely fall to their knees in disbelief and cry out, "Miracle, truly this must be a miracle." Seeing that the land, the population, and the seeds had all been set, Roland decided that it was time to decide on the last element, the custodian. He called his constantly busy assistant minister Berev. And when he entered his office, Roland asked him, "Your chief apprentice should be able to take over by now, right? I need to set up 2 new departments at the town hall." "Your Royal Highness, our manpower is not enough for this," Berev insisted. "Previously you would always first agree with me and only later would we slowly work out the details. But now it seems you always directly start with complaining." Roland secretly criticized his assistant minister, but on his face, nothing could be seen of his thoughts. "How can it not be enough? Didn't I recently allocated a group of knights to you?" During his preliminary round of screening, Roland had discovered that more than 50 knights met his requirements of reading and writing. Naturally, that would be too many teachers, so after once more screening for the best ones, he finally selected 9 knights as junior teachers, and assigned all the others as apprentices in the town hall. "Your Royal Highness, those people are totally lazy and dragging their feet on every job. Their response time is also very slow, and by the time they finally manage to copy over some information, they even end up making a lot of mistakes. In the end they are simply unqualified to become apprentices. How to discipline them is up to you." Roland slammed the table. "If they bluntly disobey the arrangement, send them directly to the North Slope mine." "But these 2 departments must be set up." "Well, Your Highness, you will always have the final say." Berev gave up helplessly. Roland said, "The first is the Ministry of Agriculture, which will be responsible for supervising the agricultural territory and the planting process." Berev was immediately stunned. It was the first time that he heard that the town's hall was even responsible for managing food production. "Your Highness, shouldn't this matter be directly decided by the serfs themselves? We have nothing to do with how much and what they decide to plant. We are only responsible for making sure that all their taxes are paid in full." "That's exactly the reason why why the crops we harvest in the past was so low." Roland quickly took his cup and drank some water, trying to cover up his slip of the tongue. "The town hall should be responsible for taking care that everyone has enough to eat and drink." "Let everyone have enough to eat and drink? Certainly you must be joking, right?" "Of course not. How important it is that everyone should have something to eat and drink doesn't even need to be said. If the town's hall is unable to ensure that everyone has enough to eat, then they aren't doing their job, but by then I will also be guilty of neglecting my duty." As for the latter part, wasn't the public toilet project started for exactly this purpose? Roland no longer spoke in a relaxed voice, and instead seriously said, "I don't know how the capital city hall used to handle this. Perhaps the life and death of the civilians do not matter so much to them, but here in Border Town, I want to implement a holistic political organization. It is absolutely necessary that the people in my territory know about it so that they will wholeheartedly support us, and we can easily keep on governing them. At present, it is important that we create this ministry and have them undertake this mission." "Understood, Your Highness," Berev said as he had to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "You will go to the archives and look for 3 or 4 people who are experienced farmers and can work in the Ministry of Agriculture, and you will then choose 2 of your own apprentices who will be in charge of the keeping the records and statistics, finally forming a group of 6 people." "Wait, you want those civilians to become town's hall officials?" Berev looked shocked at the idea. "Not only are they obedient, they are even more likely to work with plenty of enthusiasm, so why shouldn't they serve as officials?" Officials aren't equal to nobles, and the Ministry of Agriculture also needs some professionals farmers to guide the future generation. Most of them do not even know how to read or write. That is exactly the reason why you have to send 2 of your apprentices out there. They will go along to do the paperwork, Roland directly interrupted. And this problem won't exist for too much longer. I'm going to implement an educational program for everyone soon, or at least that is the plan for now. By then nearly all of the people will be able to read and write, and you will no longer have to worry about whether you won't have enough hands. Obviously, the message that civilians would start to work in the town hall was an enormous surprise for Berev. His mouth was slightly open and for a long time he was unable to say another word. Roland, disregarding whether Berev could accept it or not, just continued with giving his speech, back to the topic of setting up the Ministry of Agriculture. When the serfs began to farm their own land, it's bound to happen that they will use various kinds of methods. For example, how deep they will plow the soil will all be done differently. This is an excellent opportunity for observation, so the Ministry of Agriculture should split all the farms into groups of 6 and each member of the ministry will record every step taken by his designated farmers. Things like how deep they plow, what kind of planting interval they use and so on. It will be necessary that they work on it in as detailed a manner as possible, and that all of them will get some measuring tools and be taught on how to use them. You mean we are going to measure their contrast? Berev was clearly old-fashioned in some areas, but he was definitely a quick thinker overall. That's right, for the first time it was needless to care too much about the harvest. We will still maintain importing the food as we have been. Furthermore, we will also start to use some new wheat seeds to make sure that no one has to starve anymore. The job of the Ministry of Agriculture is to find the best method to planting, and later they have to promote, teach and supervise the way in which wheat is planted in the future. Roland didn't know much about farming, but this did not prevent him from using a scientific approach to summarize a set of optimal solutions. With this program, both the expansion of the cultivated area, or to add several new kinds of seeds to try, would help him to raise the average output to a whole new level. Berev nodded at first, but then he hesitated, and after a while, he finally asked, "Your Highness, there is one thing that I don't understand. When the serfs are promoted to free people, why will you only charge them 20% of their harvest as a tax? Even if you asked them to hand over 50%, letting them keep 50% for themselves, you would still be seen as extremely benevolent." Because there is no meaning in hoarding all the money in the basement, Roland explained. When I need more than the 20%, I will buy the rest of the food from them at a fixed price. In Border Town, the trade with food only belongs to the right of the Lord. They have to deliver all the food to the castle and will be paid for it. After some saving, they will most likely want to buy things like cattle, iron tools, beef, cotton clothes, and good brick houses. And all of this can only be provided by me for the townspeople. If they want to buy food, it will be the same thing for them. They can only buy it from the castle. In this way, the coin will still flow back into my pocket, but as long as it is cycling, it will be able to raise everyone's standard of living. Are you able to follow me with this? Berev wore a frowning expression. It was clear that he was still caught up in processing this information. Roland smiled and shook his head. It isn't a problem if you don't understand it yet. You can go back and think about it later. At the moment it is more important that you follow my orders. Hearing this, the assistant minister stood up as if he were in trance, but when he reached for the door, he suddenly looked back. Your Highness, you just said you want to build 2 departments. What is the other one? The Ministry of Education, Roland replied. However, for that I will be the one personally responsible. Chapter 139, The Devil's Power. When Berev returned to his office in the town hall, he immediately closed the door behind himself. My God, cold shivers were running down his spine. He immediately firmly grasped the god stone of retaliation hanging around his neck, once more starting to feel safe. It seems His Royal Highness really has become possessed by the devil. Previously he had only thought of it as a sort of crazy speculation, but now he was almost certainly. The one with whom he had just talked was definitely not the 4th prince. Berev could still accept his huge character changes with him becoming somewhat eccentric, but how was it possible that he would suddenly have so much new knowledge about topics he had never had any former contact with? Such a thing he had only heard of happening in myth, but in the legends, it was always God who had possessed a mortal body, moving to lead humanity out of their predicament. But since when did the devil start loving to do the same thing? If Roland Wimbledon acted like a king and engaged himself in the management of his territory, though that would become a challenging situation, Berev would not be too surprised to learn that the previous information of the fourth prince was without learning or any skills turned out to be false, but his character still couldn't be disguised. After all, it was always possible that someone had just secretly taught him how to govern a city or even a country. But Berev had never heard anything about the ideas and programs coming out of the prince's mouth. Yet, he had previously worked for 20 years in the capital city hall, even becoming the finance minister, so he should have a deep knowledge about how to organize and operate a town hall. As a minister, he had been in charge of many areas, and he even had made numerous secret deals before, but he had never betrayed his higher-ups. The king had issued a decree that a minister could decide who would work under him. So, each minister had his own power, and they all ended up handling it differently. For example, the minister responsible for the defense of the king's city had hundreds of knights and mercenaries under his control. At the same time, those underground organizations also had a lot of influence. When these forces began to rampage, they would most of the time be eyeing the criminals, but even as a noble it would soon become difficult to stay in the city. They could only wait for the king to place them into prison. But this wasn't only in the king's city, other cities also had the same situation. So, if I want to become a lord or king, the most important thing I would need is a big aristocracy or others with an influential background. If they did not have enough money to recruit any men, could it be that they had any other option that they could lean on? And the more people they controlled, the more they would be valued by others. After all, so many people can't be wrong, right? But the prince's approach completely subverted Berev's concept of how things worked. He was still the minister and still had his own apprentices, but everyone else was directly recruited and paid for by the town hall. In other words, even if he was to die, they could easily exchange him for a new person, or directly raise a person up from below him. This was a completely new system to him. Berev was now sure of it. The prince was implementing a completely new political system for the kingdom of Grey Castle. Some people may think that this was just some kind of wishful thinking on the part of Roland, or that Roland believed himself to be infallible. But Berev didn't think so. He took a quill and recorded down all of His Highness' requirements. Looking at the plans, it seemed everything was intertwined, nothing was forgotten. First, he had to manage the eat and drink for all project. Berev naturally knew that with a stronger control over the people the instructions issued by the Lord would be executed faster. But doing it in this way, it would also greatly increase the workload for the management. From where was he meant to get all these people who would need to know how to read and write? Furthermore, this would also greatly burden the Lord's own treasury. Only a few lords would be willing to do this. And then he turned his attention to His Highness' second project, the recruitment of civilians into the city hall and the education of all civilians. When Berev thought about these two projects, he couldn't suppress a shiver. If His Highness ends up being able to implement everything, how will Border Town look like? Any civilian will be able to read and write, and as long as the town hall wants to increase their workforce, they would be able to find a large number of suitable personnel. And with the possibility to enter the town hall, this will, in turn, promote the universal access to the education system. Getting a rewarding position, while at the same time getting a social upgrade, I'm afraid that it would only take 1 or 2 years, until everyone will take the initiative to request for an education. Even if they cannot get it for themselves, they will definitely plan to send their children to college. Plus, with all the previous employers' compensation paid for by the town hall, the civilians will no longer need to work all the time to get enough to eat, which is equal to completely breaking away from the situation that only the nobility has the capital to serve as administrative officials. There is no doubt that only the devil is able to come up with such a revolutionary system. Berev took a deep breath, gripping the god stone of retaliation with his hands. There was now only one question left: could the devil also be something good? If someone said that the prince was evil, he would be the first one to stand up to defend him. In his eyes, the actions of the fourth prince could be even seen as the moves of a wise king. Even those kings from the legends of the past never cared as much about the lives of the civilians as did the king. He even bought enough food to feed the civilians using his own money, so that all the common people who had stayed with him inside border town would be able to safely cross the months of demons. Furthermore, all these devils' technologies and equipment were all meant for the development of border town. Even these evil witches, they all used their abilities in order to improve the people's lives. Berev suddenly had the feeling that even if Roland became the next king of the kingdom of Grey Castle, it wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. Thinking of his father's own teachings, if he had nothing to say he shouldn't be the one to speak, if he didn't want to know the answer then he also shouldn't be the one to ask, so he decided to hide his discovery deep within his heart. Since it was the devil, and the church are already eyeing us, if the outer appearance was wrong, he could start an ambush in the devil's own camp and expose him for a lot of eyewitnesses. He shook the bell, calling for Sirius Daly, who had recently joined the town hall. Compared with the other stupid and arrogant knights, this young knight from the Wolf family could be regarded as someone truly outstanding. Although he still had the pride of being a former knight, he was still willing to listen to what his teachers had to say. "Teacher, what do you have for me?" After shutting the door behind himself he saluted before Berev. "His Royal Highness plans to open up a new ministry. It will be in charge of supervising the crops cultivation and we will need at least 2 apprentices to help them with the records." Berev repeated Roland's request in front of him. "In addition, you should go to the town's hall and pick out 10 people who meet the requirements, searching for at least 10 possible candidates, and afterwards go through another screening. Although the others are only civilians, His Highness has insisted on putting them into the town hall as well. If some of them show outstanding performance, perhaps they can even become the head of the Ministry of Agriculture. Hey," he sighed, "you will be in charge of the record keeping. However, when the spring plowing is finished, I will take you back." "Teacher, only 2 people will be selected from the town hall," he proudly said. "I am also very familiar with this procedure." "You?" Berev became stunned. "Yes. Before I became a knight, I had helped my father to manage the farm, so I know everything about the wheat planting." Sirius paused. "But when His Highness asked me if I had any other expertise, I did not say it, because I feared that he would send me to the farmland to work with the serfs." Berev liked what he heard. He had both requirements, the education and knowledge of farm work. Even if the civilian population joined the Ministry of Agriculture, he still have a candidate that could take over the lead position. For now, Sirius was loyal to him, so after he became the head, it would be the same as having the influence of the Ministry of Agriculture. "Well," Berev began, forming his words into a profitable promise, "do a good job, and maybe you can climb to an even higher position than before." When Sirius had left his office, Berev leaned against his chair while humming a light tone. Since he now knew that His Highness was possessed by the devil, he had to seize as much power as possible. The devil was always full of appreciation for ambitious people. This was commonly known and recorded in the legends. And for himself, whether his rights were conferred by the king or granted by the devil, both privileges were equally as sweet. Chapter 140 Seeds. Shortly after the assistant minister had left Roland's office, the prince received some good news. The guard whose mission it was to travel to the port of Clearwater and buy a few crops had just come back. Directly after having received the message, Roland went into the back garden, where he saw Sean already busy unloading several sacks from the horseback. It was almost a month since the day of his departure, and now as Roland looked at Sean's present appearance he discovered that the man's skin had become a lot tanner while his body became somewhat thinner. When he saw that the prince had appeared in the garden, Sean immediately stood up straight and greeted him with a salute. Roland then trotted forward to his side and patted his shoulder. "Well done, have these sacks all been filled with seeds?" Sean squatted down and unlocked the sacks on the ground. "Pearl rice, earth eggs, sugar sticks, those plants are exactly as you have described them. All of them I could only buy in the port of Clearwater, and they were indeed mostly produced in the fjords. There they have a lot of farmlands where they are cultivating these crops." "Did you ask the businessmen about what the right planting method are?" "I asked, but they couldn't tell me any specific methods to use. They could only tell me that after these plants leave the south it will become difficult to plant them." Sean grasped a handful of yellow seeds from one of the packages, then showing it to Roland said, "Your Royal Highness, this is pearl rice." The trader said that if I bought them together with the pearl rod, I could get them for a little cheaper. But taking all the pearl bars would be too heavy and inconvenient to carry, so I only bought a sack full of pearl rice and the rest are all only normal seeds. There was no doubt that the pearl rice was the corn he was most familiar with. So, Roland excitedly picked up some corn grains and took a closer look at them. Some of them seemed to be dried fruits. Apparently they had been stored as winter rations. The yield of corn production was much higher than that of the natural wheat and it had a much lower soil quality requirements. Coupled with leaves' transformation ability, he might be able to replace the wheat with corn as the new main ration. Afterwards Sean opened another package. Within it Roland could see a massive round and leather-like brown crop. These were the earth eggs. I was able to eat them during my stay in an inn in the port of Clearwater. They were peeled and cut into small pieces and then thrown into bubbling water. When chewing, it is very crisp and has a light sweet taste. Seeing this familiar shape, Roland's heart was full of emotions. This was clearly a potato. He dug his fingers into the potato and peeled it open, revealing the deep yellow potato meat. The next potato's size wasn't as big and its color also wasn't to the darker side. Not one earth egg looked like the other. He also noticed that there were some potatoes which had the same lengthily form similar to carrots. If this stuff get crushed first and then later steamed until it turned into a paste, the potatoes will become even more delicious. You have already eaten them, Your Highness? Well, it was during one of the feasts in the palace. Roland decided to sprinkle a little lie. After all, always hearing the name earth egg was just too confusing. In the royal kitchen they didn't call them earth eggs, but instead they called them potatoes, and this delicious steamed snack is called mashed potatoes. So it was something like this. It seemed that Your Highness is indeed really well informed. Sean exclaimed, then he went straight to the next sack and opened it. Within it Roland could see many black sticks. Your Royal Highness, I think this crop is the most important one I brought with me. The honey in the port of Clearwater is so cheap, and it was largely because of this crop. I heard the news in a pub that more and more farmers have begun to switch the crop on their farmland into these sugar sticks, and this magical plant is actually really sweet. When you cut open its outer skin, you can squeeze out a kind of syrup from it. Furthermore, its price is only 1/10 of that of honey, and when it is mixed into a drink it tastes isn't inferior at all to that of honey water. Roland would have liked to say that he had also already seen this crop and that it was called sugar cane, but after thinking about it for a short moment he didn't care any longer. They had already started to plant it in huge amounts, so by now it would already be too late to try and change its name. The other materials of the sugar cane could also be used for many other things. For example, they could also be used to produce ethanol, and this crop was able to raise the civilians' happiness to a completely new level. After all, the bread made from normal flour was nearly tasteless, but after sprinkling some sugar on it, its taste would be enhanced by several times. Even salt wasn't as important as this, Roland thought. Were you able to find any other crop seeds? This was all I could find in the port of Clearwater. After saying that, he took 5 to 6 small bags out and gave them to the prince. But before I started my journey you explained to me that in case I find any crop which we don't already grow here in Border Town, I should bring them back with me. Within these packages are seeds of some plants I've gathered as I passed through the Fallen Dragon Ridge and Willow Town. They are grapes, soybeans, cotton, flax, and olive tree seeds. But the farmers say that the grapes won't grow out of seeds, but you needed to stick the branches into the ground for it to grow. Although its seed can still be planted, but its germination process is very slow, and the appearing grape has neither the highest amount nor is it very tasty. Since I have leaves here, this shouldn't be a problem for me, Roland thought. Now that he had grape seeds, maybe he could have another try with his idea of a wheat tree. As for soybean, cotton, flax, and olives, they were also all very useful crops. After I let leaves improve the soil in the West, I will let some serfs cultivate them at a small scale. So that the Ministry of Agriculture, who is responsible for summing up the planting process, can add them to their manual. Your Highness, there is still some other news I have to report to you, Sean whispered. It is about the situation in Clearwater. Are they about my sister Garcia? Sean nodded. I spent nearly 2 weeks in the port of Clearwater, and with the exception of the time I needed to buy seeds, I spent most of the rest of the time in pubs. There were rumors that your sister Garcia Wimbledon and the Sand People have reached an agreement. She has allowed them to live at the southern edge of her territory, and the Sand People had instead decided to accept her as their queen and to follow her recruitment orders. During my stay in the city, I also saw plenty of Sand People walking through the streets. The extreme south is the territory of the Sand People. Although the people of Border Town don't ask others for their origin, but letting a large number of people from a foreign territory settle in your own territory is a completely different matter. It seems that in order to ensure that she can conquer the throne for herself, Garcia is really willing to do almost anything, Roland thought. The Sand People are divided into many smaller factions, so I cannot believe that all of them decided to listen to her instructions. Do you know which clans are the ones following her orders? Sean shook his head. The Sand People are very wary of the people from our kingdom. Even using some gold royals, I still wasn't able to buy any more information. But there was one more strange thing that happened on the day prior to when I'd intended to leave the port of Clearwater. On that day Garcia had returned after her victory at Eagle City, and everywhere within the city they celebrate their queen's victory against the pseudo-king, King Timothy. But the next day, they detected 4 to 5 people murdered, and one victim was even torn to pieces in the middle of the street. In the following days the port of Clearwater was closed down, and so I had to continue to stay there for the next 3 days. During the time, all the pubs were closed, and everyone would gather in the inn's lobby to talk about what information they had heard. Some people thought that it was the revenge of the pseudo-king, but one of the fishermen said that he had witnessed one of the murders. The murderer wasn't tall and also was clearly not a man of the Sand People, but his strength and speed wasn't anything like what a normal man could reach. He was later killed by the guards, but even after being hit by a lot of knife slashes he still didn't go down. In addition, his blood looked completely differently than that of a mortal, and only after even more guards rushed to the crime scene were they finally able to wear him down with their spears. When the closing order was lifted, I didn't dare to stay for any longer, and immediately came back to bring you your seeds. You have done a good job. After thinking for a short moment, Roland continued. You don't need to return the gold royals you still have left over from buying the seeds to the town hall. Thank you so much for your reward, Your Highness. A strength and speed far beyond what is possible for an ordinary person, ignoring the pain caused by knife injuries. All this just sounds like the church's pills. When Sean had left, Nightingale's voice immediately sounded next to Roland's ear. I thought the same. Roland frowned. According to Sean's explanations, Garcia got the pills even earlier than me. The church supported both sides that are competing against each other for the throne at the same time. In the end, what was it that they have in mind? Within his mind the traces of a bad possibilities popped up. Can it be that the purpose of all their actions isn't in order to ensure a stable future for the Kingdom of Grey Castle, but something else?